One day, the gates suddenly opened, giving no one a chance to adapt to the sudden phenomenon. As monsters poured out of their depths, looking at the destroyed streets and chaos-ridden cities, people began to realize that the world would never be the same again. Among the survivors began to appear those who had gained more than just strength, those who had awakened superpowers. Some of them could fight on par with monsters using fire, ice, or invisible thought power, heal wounds with a single touch, or foresee the future. They became the hope of humanity, but also a source of fear for those who remained ordinary. Some thought without realizing how they had earned this gift. Others, realizing the power they carried in their hands, were afraid of losing themselves. No one knew where the line between savior and monster was, for power not only reveals a person's true nature, but also tempts her. But one thing was certain: the old rules no longer existed in this world. Those who had awakened their power were called hunters. They were the only ones who could resist the monsters bursting out of the gate. However, there was a new challenge in the world. Organizations have emerged that unite hunters, ranking them by strength and skill level. World catastrophe is the gateway to chaos. Not everyone sought to protect the world. There were those among the hunters who saw their abilities as nothing more than power and profit. They joined shady guilds, smuggled rare artifacts, and sometimes even made deals with monsters. Meanwhile, the gates continued to appear all over the world. No one knew where they came from or if it was possible to close them permanently. Some believed it was a test for mankind. Others believed that something far more sinister than monsters lurked behind the gates. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. Cities had fallen. People no longer asked why this happened. The only question on their minds was how to survive. But one thing remained the same. Each new day was a battle for survival. And only the hunters decided what tomorrow's world would be like. As the number of gates and the threat from them grew, the hunters became not just protectors, but a new elite of society. Their power determined their status, and the most powerful among them could dictate their terms even to governments. Among the hunters, those who noticed the oddity began to appear. The gates were getting more and more complex, and the monsters inside were getting smarter and more organized. It was as if someone or something was controlling this chaos from the shadows. But after a long battle, the hunters managed to achieve what seemed impossible. Combining their powers, the 12 most powerful of them sealed the great calamity known as the Gate of Chaos. This gate was a source of endless nightmare, spawning monsters and threatening the very existence of humanity. They became legends for their exploits. People began to call them the 12 Apostles, heroes who stood guard over the world, defenders whose names are written in history. Each of them had a unique power that could change the course of the battle. 79 hours, 17 minutes, and 8 seconds had passed since entering the gate. Darkness reigned inside. The air smelled of gunpowder, and the walls trembled with the distant roars of creatures lurking in the depths. They marched forward, not knowing how long the battle would last. They were running out of supplies and strength, but they could not retreat. "I can't take it anymore." They did a good job. With those words, he collapsed on his back as the last drops of strength left him. He didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was certain: humanity had a chance for a new life. And today, our last time together as the 12 Apostles. No one responded immediately. Some nodded, others were silent, realizing that the story had come to an end. Some will fade into the shadows, some will try to start a new life, and some will stay to protect the world from new threats. But they will no longer be one. Thus ended the era of the 12 Apostles. But their legend lived on. Only the Thunder Emperor sensed that this was not the end. Something deep inside told him that the Chaos Gate was only a prologue to something greater. They did their job, but what if it was only the first wave? The Eternal Guardian muttered, pressing his lips together. Lightning flashed across his body, reflecting in the faded light of day. Gave too much to this battle. The world is saved, but it no longer needs warriors who can crush cities with a single blow. Our power is too great to be managed alone. They have never been loners. Even the strongest of them need an equal who can keep them from falling. And that's their problem. They won, but now they are strangers in this world. People will fear them. They'll look at them as someone who could be a new threat, and they must learn to be more than just weapons. Must find those who will come after them, who can keep this world in balance. They were taught to fight, not to live, taught to win, but not to find meaning in victory. Maybe it is time to learn not only how to fight, but how to really live. The boy can't be part of the hunters anymore. He wants to live, not just survive. And no longer wants to waste his life fighting for a cause that no longer exists. He believes his right that they have become what they were looking for at the beginning of the journey. But now something more has to be found. The boy can't condemn him for that, but let him know that they will always be there for him if he needs strength. He thinks his being alone will solve all his problems? They were all part of the journey, and the guy can't just pick up and disappear as if they didn't need him. He doesn't want to go off on his own and just can't be a part of what they've built anymore. The guy is looking for his way and wants to become a writer. He's unstoppable, but they need him. Too many enemies on the horizon. Thinks the world will be a better place with him gone? The guy isn't running away from the world, he's running away from what he's become. If they don't start looking for other ways than just fighting, they will lose everything they fought for. Then lastly, if he is ready to go, let him know that their journey does not end here. They are all changing and all searching for an answer. But he is not alone. And he can always give back if he feels he needs it. Before he starts his new life, let him tell a story. The story of how they came to be here. They were created for one purpose, to fight and protect. But then what? They defeated their enemies, closed the gates of chaos, and saved the world. Thought their existence only made sense if they fought. They couldn't stop because they were bound by an oath, a promise. I can't understand how someone who has gone through the horrors of war can so selflessly convey his soul through words. He doesn't just tell them about the past, but makes them feel the pain. This is not just a story, but a revelation. How can a man who has become a symbol of power and destruction turn into a man who writes about his suffering and his search for meaning in the world? His head is full of ideas, and they are not just words. They are memories of battles, memories of lost friends, and lessons he has learned along the way. Could a short story really be written? This story won't just be about war and battles. It will also be about what is left behind, how to find your way in a world where everything seems to be solved. Perhaps a short story about himself, but not as the Thunder Emperor, but as a man who battled the world and himself. The novella may be his new battle. Perhaps it won't be a conventional novel, but he hopes that each of them who read it will see in his words not only a reflection of his life, but their own. Because each one of them is not just a result of the past. They are always searching for themselves, searching for new meaning. Maybe this is a story you'll want to reread. Or maybe this book will be part of the path we all seek. It may seem strange, but once upon a time he was just like any other man. With sword in hand, with determination, with the belief that strength is everything. But now he sits here and writes. The waitress asked the guy, maybe that's what you needed to do? Sometimes the answers don't come the way we expect them to. He often thinks that the hardest part is realizing that you don't always have to look for answers somewhere far away. Everything we need, we often already carry within us, we just don't notice it. He will accomplish something far greater than he can imagine. When you devote your life to fighting, you don't notice how behind it is something much more important, self-discovery. He always thought the way of the warrior was the road of strength and victory. But now, as the boy searches for meaning in the words, he realizes that every step in this new path can also be a victory. He'll achieve things he never dreamed of before. And maybe this story will be part of something bigger than I can ever create. So how does he write next? Wants everyone who reads the story to feel not only the words, but the meaning he wants to put into them. Does he need to focus more on action, or is it better to delve deeper into thinking about the meaning of everything he's experienced? Writing about war is easy. Writing about battles, about how to win, that's what he knows how to do. But how do you convey the silence that remains afterward? How do you show that even in the darkest moments, you can find light? Perhaps we shouldn't look for the perfect beginning or ending. Perhaps it's important to just be honest. The guy isn't a hero, he's just a human being. And maybe that's the whole point. Yes, let it be so. No pathos, no falsehoods. Just him and his words. And this moment of learning to be someone again. There's not much left, that moment when the last lines begin to add up to completion. It's like the completion of a great path I've traveled not alone, but with every word. And now he realizes that it doesn't matter how long the journey took. What matters is that he goes all the way. It won't be a perfect ending. It will tell the story of how Thunder Emperor started out and ended up as a writer. But in this completion there is no end, because the story will continue on the pages in the heads of those who will read it. And if he manages to convey even a drop of what he experienced, then every step of this journey was not in vain. Yes, that will be the end of it, but only for this chapter. Or perhaps the beginning of something new. In the end, as with any great journey, the most important thing is not the completion itself, but the trail one leaves behind. The guy's not who he used to be. And who knows, maybe this new path will be even more meaningful than all the battles he's fought. But it doesn't matter anymore. He's finished, and now he can go. But where to, that remains to be seen. Lightning ripped through the sky, blinding light flashed amidst the darkness, cutting through space like a divine spear. The air vibrated, and for a moment, time stood still. A thunderous boom shook the ground. The hunter's body jerked as the unbearable charge slammed into him. His skin flashed with electrical charges, and his consciousness shattered into 1,000 shards of pain. The lightning was tearing him from the inside. His voice was drowned in the roar of the elements. It wasn't just a blow, it was a judgment. A voice broke through the chaos. Sharp, strained, but tinged with relief. Even the most tear-jerking melodrama can seem like a masterpiece compared to this plot. The guy watching the girl was outraged at the mess he saw. In front of him stood Tae-jun, the youngest student of the school and an intern in their squad. He was short, with disheveled hair and a worried look in his eyes. A figure in a black and white cloak leaned over him, the wind ruffling her hair. The light of the lantern reflected in her steely eyes. Hong Yem is the captain of the Seventh Sky, commander of the elite squad of the prestigious Guardians Guild. Very graceful looks and a great sense of style made the girl a superstar in the hunter world. Tae-jun wondered who could even believe that it was Hong Eum. The indignant girl talked about how this was an amazing scene, but Tae-jun decided to ruin the girl's precious day off. What kind of a day off are we talking about? Since you're at home, help with the chores. The boy sighed, realizing that he wouldn't be able to relax today. And if you don't want to, at least go outside and do something with yourself. Damn winner, in an irritated voice, the girl asked the guy to give her the remote. Breaking news came in about how a gate of unknown origin had opened in the Mapo district of Seoul City. Tae-jun wondered, how was Mapo? Eyewitnesses report that the neighborhood has been given red zone status and urged all citizens to stay inside their premises. At that time, the girl was about to go outside as authorities report that if you are outside, please seek shelter immediately. The guy saw her hurriedly getting ready to go outside and involuntarily wondered if she had been summoned, but she answered him no. And yet, despite her answer, she stepped over the threshold. The guy wondered if she wasn't summoned, why was she going anyway? And he whispered to her that she looked cooler in the office. She stopped for a moment, turned and looked at him. Her voice was calm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Why? The girl only grinned softly and continued on her way. And the guy shrugged his shoulders, looking away from her, and said, "You don't have to do that, do you?" She paused for a second, glaring at him, and then grinned that someone was already there, and it was our unemployed brother, or should I say failed pisser. Sitting on the floor, he sighed and muttered, but still moved to follow. Of course, who else would? The hard drive was completely crumpled, as if it had been given a good thrashing before being left here. He sighed heavily, looking into the void and swaying on the back of the octopus. Disappointedly muttered The soft tentacles twitched slightly beneath him, as if even an octopus could understand the depth of his sadness. That day, his debut work should have really worked out. But he answered frustratedly, sliding his hand across the clipboard. Tae-jun was supposed to create a sensation with his first novel, debuting as a super-duper newcomer, immediately become a famous writer, win the Web Novel of the Year award, then start lecturing and finally enter my golden years. At least that's how he envisioned it, trying to find some strength in himself. Tae-jun felt a shiver of hopelessness run down his spine. After all, this was his debut, his chance, and now everything was ruined. He couldn't type anymore. He felt it was a loss to everything. In his rage, the guy thought about how a couple of fried octopuses would definitely not be enough for him. If it came to this, he would pay them back, speaking in a whisper and pressing his lips together. The fire of determination burned in his eyes, and his mind was racing with plans for revenge. "You got the wrong guy," he whispered through gritted teeth, glaring at his opponents. "I was looking for the boss, and he was right there." This wasn't just a battle, this was the moment when all doubts vanished. The guy was ready to show what it meant to really deal with him. There was silence all around, and his words hung in the air. With a confident phrase, he said that this was the first squad, here the monsters were finished. Checking the data, he reported that the civilians had also evacuated and continued hunting monsters. His voice was firm and determined. Everyone knew there was no time to relax. The operation must be completed and reach its final stage. Everyone in the squad knew there wasn't much left, they just had to hold out. With a slight chuckle, looking at the bright flashes that were tearing through the darkness, he said that it was surprisingly simple for a spontaneous gate, and all thanks to the incredible power of our captain. As expected, thanks to the captain of the Defenders Emergency Response Guard named R.A. Ma-suk-gi, which meant a symbol of strength and determination that was the key to their success in this battle. He replied sharply for the crew to leave their chatter, as this was not the time for jokes or unnecessary words. The enemy was near, and everyone needed to prepare for the battle with the boss, as he would soon appear, and they would need to act with full determination and without the slightest doubt. Tae-jun replied with a confident look that the gate-rang boss shouldn't pose a danger, but a moment's response told him that even so they should never let their guard down, for they must always be on the alert. The commander, adding the phrase with a chuckle, said that one can never know from where the enemy might suddenly attack. We can't afford to relax, even for a second. The monsters were told to get back in formation. Their creatures now had to submit to discipline. But there was a tense silence in the air. The squad was back in fighting position, and even these monsters were now marching in column like trained soldiers. Everyone knew that the moment was drawing to a close and the battle ahead would not be easy. Fear and bewilderment crept into the voice, for Hydra was not just a monster but something more dangerous, more ancient. At that moment, everyone's attention was drawn to the strange movement in the path. If she somehow ended up here, it changed everything. Enemies weren't just enemies, they were a threat to everyone. However Hydra was engaging with them, no one could predict what would happen next. Full of terror and determination, shouted one of the fighters that the entire squad would need to raise the alarm as the boss had appeared. And then, as if out of nowhere, the Hydra gate boss appeared, where with every step their multi-headed body sprawled from side to side. The squad did not slow down as their chances were minimal, but now they had to fight to the end, blowing fire, not sparing their ammunition. Despite the furious blows, continued to move forward. It spewed jets of fire, and each step shook the ground. From the edge of the defense line, the commander shouted that a monster had appeared in the rank gate. He shouted indignantly, saying, "Has there really been a distortion of the gate?" Under such circumstances, he thought it was far more serious and they needed strong reinforcements. The monster was very furious, its eyes flashed with a bright, ominous light, and its giant claws crashed into the ground, shaking it. And then the commander shouted to his fighters, controlling the panic, to get ready, as Hydra will not stop and we have little chance. And then each of them fought for their destiny in order to survive. But in the midst of the battle, everyone forgot about fear and fatigue as Hydra kept them at ease. With every moment, their determination grew. They couldn't afford to lose. Everything they had built, their whole life and struggle, everything was at stake. Their eyes reflected not only rage but also the hope of victory. And despite the darkness, everyone knew that the only way to survive was to fight to the last man. And that's when the captain turned on his full power to fight the Hydra. At that moment, a powerful aura enveloped his body, and the ground beneath his feet began to crack from the release of energy. Tang Yijun looked irritated and shouted, "How long could they put up with all this? After all, they couldn't just sit and wait in one place for this to be completed. They all needed to buy time and hold on until reinforcements arrived to their team." But there was a problem in that all 9 heads were attacking them at the same time, making it impossible to survive. The captain knew that if he fell then in battle, the whole crew would be lost. He could not show any weakness or the world would fall with him. So clenching all his teeth, through the pain the captain went forward, knowing that there were still people he could still protect and while he still had strength. And then clutching his weapon, the captain shouted furiously that he would fight with all his might. The Hydra roared with anger that made the air shake. Her scream echoed across the battlefield, and she wasn't going to stop as her rage knew no bounds. But suddenly there was a powerful impact, and at that moment a giant wave of force cut through the flames, splitting it in two, and Hydra roared in pain. It was the first blow that really hurt the monster. And when the monster finally felt pain, the captain and the fighters realized they had a chance. One of the fighters cried out that she was very badly wounded. But the fighters managed only 2. But there were still 7 more heads ahead. The Hydra was thrashing frantically, and its anger only intensified. But the captain did not give up. Gritting his teeth, wiping sweat from his forehead, continued to fight. The angry monster struck the captain sharply before he could dodge. A sharp pain shot through his body, and he collapsed to the ground, leaving a scarlet trail behind him. The air shook with the roar of the monster. The fighters shouted its name, but everything around seemed to become blurred and deafening. He could not lie there, and then, having regained his strength, having raised his weapon, he had to continue. And overcoming the pain, the captain rushed forward, rushing into battle again. He thought that this thing would not break through, for everything was over. Something suddenly went wrong, shouted the captain at that moment. Clutching his weapon, the captain froze abruptly, looking at the Hydra. He and his crew knew that there were 7 heads left, but now all 9 rose upward as if calling for something. And then, from the very center of the thunderclouds, a certain silhouette began to descend, which was shrouded in flashes of lightning. It moved very slowly but majestically. Someone whispered in horror that it was Captain Lightning, and the squad captain's own eyes were narrowed. His fists clenched to a crunch. He was highly annoyed as he felt that the battle could only get more complicated. But Hydra roared and rushed towards Captain Lightning. At that moment, its massive body cut through the air, and its claws dug into the ground, leaving deep furrows. But the man only hummed, standing in the air, enveloped by the discharges. And in the next second, the captain swung his arm sharply, the lightning crashing down on Hydra with a deafening roar. And then in that moment, everyone realized that the god of lightning was not just a title, it was a reality. He was the one who could stop any nightmare, smite any monster, and defeat the dark forces. With menace and rage boiling in his eyes, the captain glared at his enemy, clenching his fists and lightning bolts as his anger began to spark in the air. The boss, a huge monster with curved horns and eyes blazing red fire, grinned and whispered in his low and threatening voice, so that Captain Lightning wouldn't think he could change anything since he was part of the game. Whispering in a cold voice like darkness itself, the words seemed to anger the captain to the max. Just as the captain thought, muttering to the monster stepping forward that he would not be a part of his game, as he had come to put an end to it all. But Captain Lightning wasn't listening. His energy and anger were fusing into a single force, ready to tear through anything that got in his way. Lightning began to clear the world, preparing to strike and avenge the laptop. He stood on the battlefield, his eyes blazing with fire. The moment the lightning flashed, he thought that all his written drafts were gone because of the monster. And each new lightning strike was like an answer, like revenge for all that had been lost. It was a pain for him that he didn't know how to make things right and get back what he had lost. He believed it was because of Hydra that he lost all his papers and his debut work and his first step into a new world. His words were filled with bitterness and despair, in that he had lost not only his job, but also the confidence that he could ever start anything again. Tang Yi-jun thought that Captain Lightning had completely roasted the monster, but it still didn't get any better. As he scratched the back of his head and walked forward, he thought about how he would have time to rewrite everything. He had a deadline of one day. As he continued pacing down the empty road, he thought about how he had to make it in time. But at some point he suddenly fainted. As he wakes up, he realizes that something wrong has happened here, like fighting Hydra again. Walking along the road, the guy and the girl, still puzzled by what happened, suddenly notice a figure lying on the ground ahead. The guy was glad that the captain was alive and suggested that they all wait for the rescue team. Suddenly the girl saw something up ahead. Surprised, they watched together from the sidelines and wondered if Hydra was alive, but the very dents that were on it said that it looked like it had died from a serious such blow. The boy and girl stood back, their eyes wide with wonder. They watched as Hydra lay there, a monster that until recently had been one of the most dangerous threats to the world. Resting through sleep, the captain tried to come to his senses, but thoughts of what had happened kept him awake. How could it be such a miracle that Hydra was dead? Through the pain, he couldn't believe in such a miracle. At that moment, his every cell in his body screamed that such a thing was impossible. How could such power be destroyed? All the media reported the sensational news that for the first time in so many years, the A-Rang gate in Korea was able to suddenly open. At that time, such an event shocked not only the country but also the whole world that the boss of the gate was a Hydra A-Rang. But despite his background, he was able to stand against this monstrous creature and was able to emerge victorious. He turned out to be none other than Ma Suk-ji, also known as the Bulldozer of Defense. That video called Hydra Annihilation, which was uploaded to YouTube and at that moment had earned over 100 million views. According to those reports, Mr. Ma Suk-ji, who heroically defeated the monster and saved our citizens from danger, will need about 14 weeks to recover. In addition to everything he's been through, his vocal cords have suffered permanent damage. Footage of the incident was captured, and the cause of his ligament injury was the swear word he was directing towards the Hydra at the critical moment. After the authorities and the military viewed what happened, they began to discuss and analyze the important conclusions about how he acted heroically and how he was able to protect the people and his country. But then one of the authorities stood up and began to utter the phrase that Mak Suk-ji, who had defeated Hydra A-Rang, immediately needed to be recruited into the Guardians Guild. And there were those who did not agree with this decision, because they thought that he was only an A-Rang hunter. But others thought he might be promoted to C-rank. They discussed that there weren't many hunters in Korea at that time with that level of strength, but discovered the fact that he's extremely proud to have worked at fullback. The girl was annoyed and angered by Tae-hyun's act, mentioning that he was reckless. She couldn't understand what exactly he had done at the negotiating table, accusing him of being reckless. What was in her thoughts was that if Du Hwan found out that those gates had been closed by the Thunder Emperor back then, they would not escape trouble. At that time, Guild Master C-rank Du Hwan Ku-wai-su said with astonishment, "Did everyone there really believe that a lone hunter had completely solved the matter?" The girl immediately detected something, that the master was able to understand everything and thought about the fact that she and Hyun would be screwed. The guild master looked at the girl and noted the fact, whether or not they really agreed with his opinion, that one person couldn't handle Hydra alone. But the girl only grinned, trying not to show her true emotions. The only question in her mind was what was he thinking? And then the girl firmly insisted that the hunter had indeed managed to slay the hydra. But the master did not believe, as he believed that only one legendary hunter could handle that victory, who once ignored him and disappeared without a trace. However, in the back of his mind he noted that here it was at last, the legendary Thunder Emperor. He confidently assured that he would find him himself. The Thunder Emperor is found and soon finds himself under interrogation. And there they start questioning him about how he managed to kill the Hydra and close the gate. But he resisted and claimed only that he was merely being a writer. In that interrogation, he was angry at being accused of killing Hydra and insisted that he was really a writer, not a hunter. But Gold Brand Publishing, the editor of the third team, Ku Gen Mo, argued that they needed to stop questioning because they were not able to have a constructive dialogue. And then the guy retorted by admitting to the editor that he wasn't interested at all. He thought the setting was good, but for the umpteenth time he repeated that every monster died with a single blow. At that point, the young man felt that his story lacked realism. And if this continued, readers would not empathize with the character, would lose interest and abandon his novel. But he did his best to describe the process as excitingly as possible. At that moment, the editor was just reading that the Chimera's brain was spilling outward. It looked like the editor's focus was on the guy not getting too deep into the details, but focusing on the overall dynamics and atmosphere. After the guy watched the news, the editor tried to keep a balance between keeping the story exciting and not overloading the readers with unnecessary details. Since the hunter from the defender had almost died saving people from the suddenly opened gate. And let everyone imagine for a moment that just a hunter, not even a highly ranked one, risks his life in those moments to save ordinary people. Then what kind of tense, desperate battle was it supposed to be? After all, the people felt everything then, even though they were not there personally. That's why everyone should have remembered that hunter back then. Even if they weren't there, it was as if they were present. He felt as if in that moment the people of the country had experienced everything and what was going on in his soul. After all, Captain Max Sukji needed support from the people back then. But he could not accept that popularity because he felt responsible for those who strongly supported him. But in order for the reader to truly empathize with the character, it is necessary not only to show his actions, but also to immerse him in the world in which he was surrounded. That's what realism is all about. At that moment, the guy faced an unexpected and difficult-to-understand criticism. His surprise was understandable as the editor touched on deeper aspects of the narrative. He felt guilt and confusion, realizing that he was not yet capable of understanding the depth of what the editor had demanded of him then. And then the editor looked at the boy thoughtfully, as if trying to figure out where exactly his process was stuck. Perhaps he should have approached the matter more gently, not immediately demanding what was possible. Sighing quietly, looking at the boy, the editor whispered softly to him that he was giving him another chance and he had exactly 1 week to rewrite that very short story. Following the editor, the boy quietly whispered words of gratitude. He truly felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But deep down, he knew he would make it up to him in that moment. Leaving, the editor then stopped in the doorway and quietly told the guy, with a touch of severity, that if he failed that time too, he had to cancel the contract. Those words hung in the air, and the boy froze as he felt the weight of responsibility immediately become much heavier for him. And all he had to do then was work hard, correct, and not fail, otherwise all the chances could have gone and more chances would never come. That morning he woke up thinking that the beginning of a new day would be different for him. And in his head, he replayed the possible reaction of his boss. And so seized with excitement he entered the office then, but the chief did not even dignify him with a glance, only grinned and threw the following phrase as a mistake of nature. Utterly frustrated, his body falls exhaustedly to the couch and his arms drop down powerlessly. He looked at the editor's reaction with sadness and surprise, unable to believe such a cruel assessment. The editor grumbled unhappily and waved him off with a phrase for him to stop humming like a ship. The image of his brother popped up in his mind with the thought of what should he do next. After all, because of all the blunder, he could have been fired and deprived of his last chance, crossed out all the efforts, left without an opportunity to prove that he was capable of more. And if he doesn't edit the material properly at that point, his contract will be terminated, thought the brother. Sitting on the couch with his brother, the boy listened to his reasoning. His brother frowned thoughtfully and said that he needed to make the story more realistic, but he didn't seem to have any idea how to do it. At that moment, his brother looked him in the eyes and asked him curiously what he was writing then. But the boy took a deep breath and grinned and told him to get ready to listen. He talked about how his character had single-handedly dealt with 30 monsters, yes, and another blow despite their high rank. But it turned out that none of that had anything to do with realism. And then my brother was outraged that there was no logic in the text. And how could such a thing be written at all? His brother looked at him in bewilderment and asked about whether he had ever fought at all. But in the same second the guy clenched his fists and looking at his brother replied that of course he had fought. His brother continued to ask him when exactly he had gone to the battle. But the boy looked down at him with a grin and replied that it had all happened during the opening of the Chaos Gate. There was a whole 70 hours of battle with the monster. Pensive, the brother asked the guy in bewilderment as to how it was even possible to take such a thing as an example when the fight was on the brink of apocalypse. His brother couldn't bear the thought and kept asking him how many hunters existed in the world. The guy thought for a while and answered that there were 12. After all, half of the hunters in that world were between the F and C ranks. Even achieving that rank meant securing money for life, with the ability to live on a whole other level. Hunters with such a rank were not just rich, they had power on par with the heads of large corporations, making decisions that determined the fate of entire industries. Even if S-rank hunters were rare, then how could ordinary people understand the lives of the legendary ones? But readers often imagine themselves in the protagonist's shoes. So they prefer stories where the protagonist is at a level similar to their own at the beginning and then gradually grows in strength. And then my brother thought the story would have to start by creating a compelling protagonist that readers could easily associate themselves with. But the lad felt that before he started researching and analyzing, then he would need to see for himself. He thought it would be worth it to see how ordinary hunters fought to know where to start. It was then that his brother pointed out to him what he could show. But the lad replied with regret and determination in his voice that he was not even a hunter anymore. But the brother looked at the lad with irritation and whispered, not knowing what to do next with him. And then the boy knelt down and asked him to let his brother help him, shouting after him to go to the Korean Hunters Association and that the director would explain everything to him. And then the guy thought about the fact that after all, he is the Thunder Emperor, that he is the only legendary hunter of Korea who slew the Beast of Destruction. After all, it was the very truth that he was the Thunder Emperor. The moment the guy realized that he was that emperor, he made the decision to go to the Korean Hunter Association. The head of the Korean Hunters Association, Park Jae-han, thought it was a complete impertinence. It was after the past relegation threat that they steadily carried out the operation described in the National Gates, and that's when they proved the effectiveness of their training programs for hunters. What to speak of when a city in France was then on the verge of destruction? They sent their guys in as reinforcements, which helped keep the city safe. Addressing that, even Germany then asked them for information on training for hunters, and they helped them too. The Hunter Association's teacher was seized with full aggression and shouted with rage that they too were denying them a rank increase. And then he exclaimed, outraged, that this was a complete absurdity. The director of the Association of India, Grover Gulshat, calmly replied that they would not do anything about it. He talked about how 11 countries, including their own, were capable of supporting the legendary hunters, but it was an impossible task for South Korea. The Indian director also claimed that their legendary hunter was brainwashed, causing him to suddenly resign. The head of the Korean Hunters Association asked the question, who governs hunters anyway? And why does the power of national governance suddenly disappear for no reason? Director Park Jae-han claimed that the situation was a personal decision of the man himself. However, the girl intervened and sharply objected that all she had heard were just excuses. And how dare they even ask for a promotion? But the director of the Indian Hunters Association with a chuckle has repeatedly said that a country can only be promoted to a top spot if one of its citizens is a legendary hunter. But the head of the Korean Association insisted that they should at least be promoted to the second rank. And that was the end of his arguments, for their meeting lasted for a very long time. It was decided to discuss the issue of Korea's position in the ranking next time. At the end of the meeting, Park Jae-han expressed her gratitude for her hard work. The head of the Korean Hunter Association was deeply upset, realizing that his efforts had not yielded the desired result. The secretary entered the office and looked at Park Jae-han regretfully, not knowing how to comment on his condition as he was filled with rage. But the head of the association was very nervous and divined that they had been happily accepting their help up to that point, but now they had suddenly decided to draw a line in front of them. The secretary watched the whole thing, sighed, and in a calm voice tried to reassure the principal that they still had meetings ahead of them and needed to keep cool. And then the principal, taking a deep breath and calming down a bit, turned to his secretary, what's next on his schedule? The secretary quickly flipped through the documents and informed the head that one of the guilds that had responded to the request for cooperation was the Scorpion Guild. However, the head should have thought twice before meeting with them. But the secretary tried to convey to the chapter that their reputation left a lot to be desired, though rumor has it that they often set up rival people. The secretary tried to convey that it was obvious that they were using their support to monopolize the high-ranking gates, and if they cooperated with them, the reputation of the association would be severely damaged. And at that moment, the director was deep in thought. After all, they are the Korean Association, and if the guild is recognized by the government, they should meet with them. But to be honest, head Park Gahan didn't want to see their faces. He thought that if they accepted the Scorpion Guild, the other guilds would be able to claim them. Then the secretary answered the phone to someone, as if encountering such strange types for the first time. We'll just have to throw him out by force. The head of the Korean Association asked the guards what all the noise was about. The receptionist tipped his head with a sigh and said some guy in the lobby insists on meeting with you, claiming to be the son of a grocery store owner or something. Park Jae-han grinned and said, how do the kids of grocery store owners decide that they can just barge in like that? And the secretary apologized that he should have dealt with this earlier. The head of the Korean Association reflected that that guy had non-stop asked to tell him that he was from Taejongdi's store and assured him that he would definitely understand him. And then the head asked the secretary again to repeat what he had just said. Is he really the son of the shopkeeper Daejeongdi? After all, it was the son of the store owner Taejongdi Tae and Hyun, the Thunder Emperor, the legendary hunter who had retired. The head of the Korean Association reacted to that information in shock. The head exclaimed indignantly, gave orders to immediately contact the lobby and inform them of the upcoming meeting. Then, noticing the elevator delay, he exclaimed, why is this elevator so slow? And then the secretary saw the guy in the hallway and shouted, Director, look, to which he quickly reacted to be detained and not allowed outside. Outside the Hunters Association building, a car appears with the leader of the Scorpion Guild in it. The leader of the Scorpion Guild, whose name was Cho Jin-nam, said with a chuckle, look at this place. The Hunters Association spared no expense. Still, stale Uncle Park Jae-han agreed to meet with them since they are very prestigious. But Cho Jin-nam said with a smirk, does he have any idea how much money he's getting? He had no choice but to meet me. And then the headmaster ran towards him with aggression, shouting loudly, where is he? Meanwhile, the head of the Scorpion Guild walked towards him and grinned at him, saying how he was so eager to meet him that he ran out barefoot towards him. But Cho Jin-nam did not hide his mockery and shouted loudly for the principal to run to him. And the principal, angry, ran down the hallway as hard as he could and shouted loudly to everyone to the side. The director did not slow down and shouted loudly, do you even realize who you're blocking the road to? But he didn't slow down in time and knocked down one of the Scorpion Guild members. Realizing his guilt, he immediately apologized. It turned out that the director wasn't running to the Scorpion Guild, but to Hen. And running up to him, he apologized for the delay and for making him wait so long. How many years, how many winters, Hen thought. He thought he would never see the head of the Korean Hunters Association again. The director replied to the young man that his visit was reported too late. But it didn't matter as he wanted to know the purpose of the meeting. Hen informed him that he wanted to discuss something. The head of the Korean Hunter Association was surprised and pondered if the Lightning Emperor intended to return from retirement. And then Park Jae-han was stunned. Was the Thunder Emperor really coming back? His thoughts whirled and he could barely contain his joy. He still hasn't forgotten about the Hunters Association. After all, Korea would become great again after the legend returned. He even thought about the possibility that he wanted to watch the fights. The director of the Korean Hunter Association happily noted that he had long expected these words from the Thunder Emperor and immediately ordered to prepare everything necessary for surveillance. But the secretary also replied that he would like to watch the fights. The Thunder Emperor clarified that he would like to see the battle of ordinary hunters up close. But in return, he was to provide his support and mentoring to improve their skills. The Lightning Emperor promised that in return for the opportunity to personally observe the battles of ordinary hunters, he would fulfill the request of the association director. In exchange for the opportunity to watch the hunters fight in person, he would consider the director's offer. This statement effectively summarized their agreement. The contract started with them starting a partnership and allowing him to investigate for his writing needs, but only if he would act under the Thunder Emperor's name. Hen thought for a moment, how else could he do the research? Suddenly the thought struck him. Here it was, the perfect option. The director replied to him that they had a job perfectly suited to his requirements. And if the Thunder Emperor returned, Korea's national rank would rise and the country would regain its place on the world stage. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away from him. His job title was assistant at the gate. Then Hyun sadly wondered, what kind of gate helper? After all, such a job usually went to S-rank's hunters. After all, they collect the loot of gates cleared by other hunters and control the exits from the location if necessary. They also provide assistance in combat, stepping in at critical moments if the need arises. Help keep hunters safe during emergencies. Of course, those who fulfill such a role rarely have to engage in combat. More often than not, they simply stay behind, watching and waiting for orders. The director of the Korean Hunter Association excitedly thought that such a position was perfect for observing the battle of the hunters. The Lightning Emperor muttered with a smile that he didn't know such a job existed. The director thought that of course he couldn't know about the helpers since Hyun had fought in battles where no S-rank hunter would ever go. The boy thanked the director and told him that this was just what he needed. Then the director once again asked if he was really ready to become an assistant. The director ordered the rest of the parts to be sent to Jeonggi's store. The secretary wondered if the Thunder Emperor had always been so carefree. The director sternly reminded him that it wasn't just eccentricity, he was still the greatest part of Korea. And now Hyung was happy to announce that he had arrived. A place known among hunters as a guild of the rank of Happy Together. It was a gathering place for those who had achieved great success in their profession. He talked about how here at the Ranga Guild he would finally learn the ins and outs of the hunter world and actually write a realistic story that would reflect not only their exploits but also the hardships they face. Walking into the office, he started to say hello, introducing himself that his name was Tae and Hyun, spelling out that he will be here as an assistant who is willing to support the team. Inside the office, they said with interest, today's gate attendant. Was it really true that the gate had opened? Tae-hyun sadly reminded them that he had come to work as just an assistant. The man noticed with a chuckle that they were a bit fidgety. And then the boy wondered if this was what their atmosphere was really like. And he told the guy with a smile that he was glad to meet him and introduced himself as Manhwa Song, the head of the Happy Together Guild. The guy also reciprocated with a smile and bowing slightly in respect, introduced himself that his name was Tae-hyun and he too was pleased to meet him. Manhwa Song invited Hyun into the office with a slight smile and explained that there were only 3 official members in their S-rank guild. Puzzled, the boy asked who was the third. He was told by the head of the Happy Together Guild that the third was assigned elsewhere. But the guy still wondered what kind of assignment he was talking about, and the guy excitedly noted that it was like the distribution of the 12 apostles around the world. The head of the Happy Together Guild gestured for the boy to sit down and with a slight pity in his voice, remarked that it was a pity he had to join them. Hen asked indignantly why. Then the second guild member grinned and advised the guy to take a good look around him first, and think about whether they were okay working there. The second guild member pointed out that here they were sitting at rank C, but were paid little and lived from paycheck to paycheck. The boss irritatedly asked him not to go into details, and then the head irritably told his partner that he was too young to talk so much. The boy watched their argument attentively, turning to his partner Manhwa Sung. He also thought of the two of them as if they were very close companions who had been through so much together. The guild leader remarked with a smile that they were almost like family after all these years. However, they mutually emphasized that they weren't exactly thrilled about it. A thought flashed through the guy's mind. This is what loyal companions are really cool, like in some hunter story. Wait a minute, said the boss, perplexed. What was he thinking? And the partner laughingly replied, I guess we really are like old friends. Hen replied that with that level of camaraderie, their teamwork in battle must be amazing, and asked when they would be going to the gate. After all, their guild doesn't have missions with gates, and it called into question how prepared their team was for such missions. Not realizing what the conversation was about, he looked at his interlocutors in surprise, asking them the question. In a loud voice, the guy shouted, Wait a minute. Isn't this the Hunters Guild? His eyes were filled with bewilderment and rage. That's right, said the leader, because low-ranked guilds rarely participate in anything. But the guy did not know how to behave further, and what should he do? The boss answered him very briefly and calmly that nothing. Hen thought with understanding about how the gate really didn't open every day. So much for realism. Then he added decisively that he would do anything to get a job. And then the two supervisors exchanged glances and shouted mockingly, How about cleaning up? After all, it was definitely his turn today. The lad answered them that they could rely on him completely, but the older boss, turning to the young one, said with a chuckle that it wasn't serious to put a rookie to work. And then he thought to himself that there was only a week left before his contract was terminated and he would comprehend realism, everything would change. Thought about his creation waiting for him. Overjoyed, he shouted out that there were 6 days left until the contract was terminated. Saying hello, he mouthed what should he do today? Under orders from his boss to clean the hallway, the guy didn't mind and readily agreed to do the task. realizing that it was his duty and part of his job in the guild. The guy with a smile said, "And hello again, I have 5 days left on my contract before termination." Then he turned to one of the chiefs, asking if there was any news about the gate. He grinned and replied that if so, they would not be sitting idle. The guy thought about it and asked, then what would they do today? The young supervisor grinned and handed him a rag so he wouldn't ask him too many questions. The guy sighed, accepted the rag silently, and started cleaning the windows. As the new day dawned, he walked into the office, sighed tiredly, and whispered sadly that it was only 3 days until the contract was terminated. The warden met him with a smile on his face but with tears in his eyes, holding a broom in his hands. And with a positive attitude, the lad said about his new assignment. Tired of cleaning, he wondered if it would only be 2 days before the contract was terminated and then it would all be over for him. A thought flashed through his mind that everything had seemed interesting to him on the first day. He noted that he had done nothing but clean up for the entire week he had been in that building. With rage and frustration, he shouted that he hadn't even touched a real job. He missed his deadline without ever writing a word, worried that he had missed the chance to fulfill his goal and now didn't know how to fix the situation. When the building was already empty, the editor sat in a closed office, working hard at his computer, desperately trying to correct all his mistakes. There was a deep sadness in his gaze, disappointment at the lost time, fatigue from sleepless nights, and anxiety at the inevitable future that he could not change. Someone silently brought him a glass of cold water, as if sensing his fatigue and inner tension. The barely perceptible gesture of concern brought him out of his deep reverie, making him momentarily distracted from his thoughts and realize how much he needed a break. When he approached the editor, the assistant curiously asked him, "Are you working again because of that newcomer?" He whispered that he was writing a report on him again. The assistant sighed and wondered what had become of the prestigious Gu Kenemo, editor of authors whose books were becoming bestsellers. And turning to him, he asked him in bewilderment why he was wasting his time on some newcomer. He tried to convey to the editor what he had heard about the newcomer, that he wasn't that good. But the editor knew all about it and didn't understand why he had taken him on in the first place. The editor thought his writing was desperate. He pondered as if there was a faint hope for something hidden in his words. "You realize this is the last time I'm giving him a chance." The lad realized in despair that he was only 1 day away from the termination of his contract, and after everything was over for him, he fully recognized that it was his own failure. Budding web novel author Tae-hyun closely observes the work of the S-Rank Guild of Happy Together, seeking more valuable experience to create a more realistic story. The web novel author still has 0 words in the draft, and there are exactly 0 days left until the contract is terminated. A web novel author is in a desperate situation. The draft is empty and the deadline has passed. If the author is fired now, there could be many years without publication ahead, as much as 10 years of silence. One of the guild heads glanced at the author and informed in a flat tone that the spontaneous gate came in the afternoon, so we should prepare to go out. Hen only nodded and calmly replied that he would prepare everything for cleaning now. The guy got very excited when he heard that the gate dispensation had indeed arrived. Hen will finally get to see real hunters in action. Today, he'll finally be able to write. He will be able to express himself freely and develop ideas while immersed in the world of his creativity. Guild leader Manhwa Song wondered why his men looked so glum, whether it was because of the upcoming task or something else. His partner said, "What are you thinking about?" "It's because of the gate of the W ring." And then Hen replied that it was nothing, was it? For a C-rank guild like theirs, mopping up a gate of this rank alone was impossible. Therefore, the 3 guilds decided to join forces and work together. Then Hen said that it removes the risks and is actually quite good news. And the guild leader muttered that he was right. The problem is the guilds they have to work with. Kowundo province, the gateway to Saraksano, is the Valley of the Wolves. Those places are known for their history and the dangers lurking beyond their borders. Ooh, and his back. It's been a long time since he's been to the mountains. And now the gates have decided to open at the very edge of nowhere. At least he wouldn't complain, but would say thank you for getting the job after all. The head lost the newcomer, but he soon emerged from what he saw around him. And this was the site of the gateway to the rang. Hen marveled at the fact that even the rocks there looked different. He asked what kind of weapons they use and what about skills. The guild leaders were shocked by the guy. Manhwa Sung thought, is he really going to collect from everyone? But his partner had no idea. He shrugged his shoulders and said, maybe he's just collecting tips. "Oh, what people," he exclaimed, looking at what was happening with amazement. "These are the lucky ones," shouted Guild S-Rank Flaming Bear, guild leader Richard Bear. Manhwa Sung motioned for the guys to say hello. After all, this was the head of the main almshouse of the hunter world. He also took a look and sighed heavily. and thought, why did he have to get that freak out of all the people? The head of the Happy Together Guild approached Flaming Bear about how he had heard that they were excellent at training newcomers so that others would take them. To which Richard Bear contradicted him. That work for the public good and the same philanthropist, right? After all, you'd have to be a complete idiot to raise your guild members this way. Oh really? Thought the guild leader. Happily together, they are probably only being prepared to be passed on to others. The lull ended as the guild leader spoke again. It's time to discuss how you deceive people. I wonder who he thought would do such a thing and take their recruits away, and now he's mocking them. I guess he didn't have enough of those guys, huh? Richard Bear grinned and glared at him, saying that he had already dared to get into adult conversations. And in response, the head of Happy Together told him that except for Ma Sa-sung's brother, he hadn't seen any adults. All he saw was a bunch of kids getting into fights. Ha ha ha, they're all so funny, muttered the guild S-rank mantis who was called Sa-ma-rin. She said, what was the point of the rivalry between the two deadbeats then? With a smirk, she also mouthed off about whether or not they were sure they wanted to spend all their energy. And then they thought they would still need those to help them in closing the gate. The mantis S-ranga said with a chuckle to them, to even pick up scraps, they'd have to do a good job. Finishing it with the disdain that they were morons. This was madness real, Hen thought, feeling his mind struggling with the reality of what was happening. They hadn't even entered the gate yet, and already such an exciting and powerful conflict had been unleashed. Thinking that this was true realism, he would finally see a battle of real hunters. With aggression, someone turned to him, asking the newcomer when he was going to finally introduce himself. He also replied that newcomers have been so slow lately. Just for information, I asked him that if he even touched his monsters with a finger, he might not make it to the exit. And that moment the guy thought, trying to comprehend what was happening and assess what he should do next in this strange and tense situation. He was completely confused, not knowing how to react to what was happening. His thoughts were chaotic, trying to find some logical explanation for the situation. The boy saw Sir ahead of him and he noted aloud, hoping they could work together. Next he was going to talk about how even assistants have their own problems with hierarchy. He was still writing something when he was approached by someone from the team that they were about to go in already. One of the crew warned him for keeping his eyes open and trying not to get dead. That's what Hen had warned him for. At some point, a monster ran out of the shadows, ready to attack. At that moment, he was attacked by the guild leader of the Happy Together Guild, and they began to fight together. But Richard Bear rushed toward him, ready to engage. The indignant guild leader exclaimed that it was extremely dangerous. Richard Bear only grinned and replied that he should work faster, that if he didn't like something, he should earn his share, and that he shouldn't flick his beak. They managed to wound the monster, causing it to stagger and let out a furious roar. However, despite the pain, it was still dangerous and would not give up. All that's left is to deliver the final blow to finish off the monster and end the battle. They fought as hard as they could, coordinating attacks and trying to strike a decisive blow to finally finish off the monster. Richard Bear turned to the guild and said with a chuckle as if he hadn't even noticed him. And then Hyun thought with a surprised expression on his face, did the battles of ordinary hunters really go on like this? He pondered, realizing that what was happening was utter chaos. They were arguing over who finished the monster first, and one was yelling at the other to get his damn hands off. He threw an irritated phrase for the idiots to get out of the way, because he didn't give a damn. He had never seen anything like it. What an absurd battle this is, he thought, trying to make sense of what was happening. The S-rank goddess replied with a slight chuckle, noting how convenient it was. She continued, explaining that this was why it was best to have exclusive hunting rights. And then one hunter nodded and replied, so true. It is with exclusive rights that they can use the strategy that suits them best. Let the bugs deal with their own weaklings, he grinned. He confidently stated that their guild would deal with the boss. And then he thought about it and said, that's already a really effective strategy, isn't it? The S-rank goddess thought yes, and so, as if on cue, he appeared. And so the boss of these gates appeared, towering over everyone with his intimidating figure. A group of warriors stood in a fighting stance, swords clutched in their hands. Their gazes were focused, their muscles tense, and their blades gleamed in the light, reflecting their readiness for battle. After they finished this thing off, promotion to W rank would only be a matter of time. He looked at his opponents and thought that these insects could no longer match him. And then they triumphed by destroying all the monsters. He laughed, savoring the moment. The sensation of the blade piercing the flesh of his enemies was awesome. The S-rank goddess responded with a smile that this was the true taste of victory. She went on, confidently declaring that no one else would be able to look down on her, and that it was time to call it a day. But there was another monster ahead of them, ready for another fight. All the hunters froze in shock, realizing what they were about to face. It turned out that the direwolf, a formidable and dangerous predator, was standing in front of them. The bear exclaimed indignantly, trying to figure out what the A-rank monster had forgotten in this place. Then Hyung thought with surprise how glad he was to see that pestle, for he reminded him how they had driven them into the gate of the S-Rank. But the pestle, paying no heed to their words, began slowly advancing towards them, preparing to attack. He moved forward with a powerful jerk, knocking down anyone who tried to get in his way. As the S-Ranga stepped forward, preparing to engage, her gaze remained cold and focused. He shouted, warning the others, and there was bewilderment in his voice. Was this really the monster? It turned out to be a distortion of the gate, a dangerous phenomenon that changes everything around it. Gate distortion is an unpredictable phenomenon in which a high-ranking boss suddenly appears inside the gate, changing the outcome of the entire hunt, which leads to an increase in the rank of the gate itself, making it even more dangerous. A direwolf is an A-Ranga, right? The A-Rang presented an insurmountable wall to the B-Rang hunter, forcing the latter to consider his chances of survival. The distortion of the gate was a nightmare. Why was it happening right here and now? For C-Rang hunters, the chances of surviving the A-Rang gate were practically nil. Their chances of survival were even lower than the average person in the simplest of gates. The hunters panicked as they tried to escape, realizing the hopelessness of their situation. The S-Rang goddess pondered, wondering how and why things had turned out this way. She had almost reached S-Rang, but why had it happened now? With sadness and sorrow, she thought about it. And that's after all she's been through. She couldn't afford to die like that, sorry. She screamed in rage, unable to contain her emotions. However, the direwolves were becoming more and more enraged, hoping to attack the hunters with renewed vigor, shouted one of the hunters. The others were also calling for help, desperate to deal with the attack. Richard Bear made his way through the chaos of the battle, loudly ordering those around him to give way, eager to come to the hunters' aid. Richard Bear loudly urged the hunters to pull themselves together, trying to restore order to the battle. The association was immediately alerted to the distortion of the gate and began to respond to the situation promptly. The main thing is not to lose their minds, and then they will have a chance to leave alive. He went on to say that if they escaped and hid well, they would soon be rescued by the hunters sent by the association. But there was less and less time to think about it. The direwolf was not going to wait. He stated emphatically that he would buy as much time as he could and ordered the others to get out immediately. One of the hunters shouted, looking anxiously at the Happy Together leader, "Well, how about you?" The hunters thanked him and, apologizing, told him they had families waiting at home. Such a monster was impossible for him to defeat, but he could last long enough so that the others can escape in time, thought the guild leader of the Happy Together Guild, clutching the weapon in his hands. One of the hunters chuckled at the fact that he had decided to be a tough guy just now. It was just that he thought he was facing one of the 12 apostles. The head of the Happy Together Guild laughed with a smirk while looking at his comrade, stating that since things had gotten this far, it was worth it to leave nicely. He muttered perplexedly to his partner, was he really okay with dying so stupidly? His partner grinned loudly and dropped the phrase that the fact remained that they were doomed. So there was no need to play the hero of a war movie. The guild leader of the Happy Together Guild looked at him sternly and sharply said that he was too petty to stay here and he too should leave immediately. Man Sa-sung regretfully apologized to Hyun for dragging him into this situation. Anyway, Hen replied that he now understood everything and was finally realizing the situation. Some had no choice but to flee in haste, and some were doomed to fall despite their best efforts. It was a battlefield where everyone fought, putting their lives on the line, and nothing could guarantee them victory. Hen looked at the guy, a little puzzled by the situation, and took a deep breath and thanked him. He realized that he had risked his life to help and it hadn't gone unnoticed. Running in different directions, their steps uncertain and chaotic. Everyone who is still on their feet is desperate to find shelter, but new obstacles appear in front of them. He screamed in rage at not being able to hit a single monster, but the guild leader ordered Son of Ho to get out. The guild leader, with tears in his eyes, shouted that this was their end. He also shouted to Hen, ordering him to stay put, grinning, noting to himself this observation. The observation was thorough and comprehensive, covering all relevant aspects of the situation, analyzing the smallest details and considering the possible consequences. And then, the Lightning Emperor confidently declared the Thunder Wheel, his crushing technique bringing destruction to all who dare to stand in his way. In the raging whirlwind of electrical discharges, the monsters were flailing around in a chaotic circle, their bodies shuddering from the lightning strikes. The power of the lightning was only 5%, but even this low power was already causing a staggering effect. Unable to contain his surprise and annoyance, the guild leader of the Happy Together Guild exclaimed, "What the hell?" As the lightning bolts flashed around them and the monsters wrapped their bodies around them, they seemed even more threatening than usual. Lightning Thunder exhaled admiringly as he watched the scene while barely audibly escaped his lips as he realized the full power of the element in front of him. Thunderbolt continued to rave about how spectacular and incredible it was. He finally realized that this was how hunter stories grabbed people's attention, making them hold their breath and watch every moment. One of the hunters shouted loudly, warning him of the danger approaching from behind. Lightning Thunder noted that through their confrontation, he had gained valuable experience that would definitely come in handy in the future. The guild leaders chattered in astonishment. That's the Thunder Emperor. Is the newcomer really him? In response, Thunder Emperor only apologized, citing a lack of time, and hurriedly left. The Thunder Emperor asked them to promise not to tell anyone about it, and then remarked with a chuckle that it wouldn't hurt for them to see a doctor. The hunters froze, mesmerized as they watched the giant wheel of lightning spinning around them. The bright discharges flashed, creating a dazzling glow, and the air crackled with tension. They were in complete amazement, trying to comprehend what had happened. They exchanged glances as if asking each other a question, not believing what they had seen. So, on the scene, radioed in to report what had caused the A-Rang monster to appear. The hunters nearby were in shock at the unexpected event. Explosions were confirmed and 2 people were conscious. The injured had to be rescued first. A gate distortion occurred that day, resulting in a rank upgrade to A. Fortunately, the hunters on the scene were successfully rescued. He reflected on the fact that there were only 23 hours and 59 minutes left, and he realized that there was 1 minute left before Hen's contract was terminated. But at that moment, the editor receives a cell phone message in which Hen apologized for calling late and asked if by any chance he was awake. The editor sat at his desk, his gaze tired and his face reflecting the tension of the previous day. He picked up his phone, silently scrolling the screen with his finger, and stopped on a message from Hen. Lightning fast, he read it, raising his eyebrows slightly. Hen apologized for the late text and mentioned that he was sending a draft. The editor, reading it, reflected that Hen had obviously sent it at the last minute, barely having time to complete it. As he read the text, he prayed that everything would go smoothly this time. He was already tired of writing reports on him and worrying about every deadline. He looked down at the phone screen in thought, rereading the message. His thoughts were racing, as they always did at times like this. There was a strange mixture of relief and anxiety inside, and once again he thought that perhaps it really had all gotten too complicated. Lingering his gaze on the phone, he wondered, asking himself why it was now that this message had caught his attention. A few days later, the editor recalled again the night he received the message from Hen. With delight, someone exclaimed that he was back. The child turned to his mother with curiosity, pointing at the man and asking if it was true that he was also a hunter. But the mother frowned and hastily told her son to close his eyes, adding that he was a disgrace. He paced forward, thinking about how much the guys would be surprised, because he, superior, invincible, had returned in the C rank. It had been 6 months since he had been assigned to the V-Rank Guild, where he had been training under his cousin. There were many challenges along the way, but each step brought him closer to growth and development. After endless days and nights of grueling training, he finally made a breakthrough. He broke out of the D-Rank. So the Happy Together team welcomed him, and he said with a confident smile, "Goodbye, loser hunter. He's probably C-ranked with them now." Hen wondered why there was such silence all around. He wondered if they even knew he was coming back. The team greeted him with cheers, saying he had been gone so long and had grown incredibly in such a short time. Hen raised his eyebrows in surprise and grinned in what he would remind them about the parties and decided to play along. With delight, standing at the door, Hen shouted loudly to the boys that he was back. In the spacious office, they sat opposite each other. There was tension in the air, mixed with fatigue. The meeting was obviously going to be long. One of them frowned and squinted his eyes and asked, "Who are you?" The other, a little confused, but quickly pulling himself together, calmly replied, "Who is he?" They continued to look at each other. Hen introduced himself as the new assistant at the gate, but his interlocutor asked in surprise, as if he hadn't expected to hear such a thing. This meant that there was a lower rank in front of him. The interlocutor curiously clarified his rank, noting that he belonged to the F category. Hen nodded confidently, confirming his words. He proudly announced that he had recently been promoted to the rank of Sea Hunter. He listened intently, absorbing every piece of advice he was given. The boss hesitated, realizing that the newcomer turned out to be the Thunder Emperor, and yet he was being forced to clean the office. After a short pause, he just nodded and replied, "Yeah." The chief said with a chuckle that he should rest in peace, he would pray for him. Then, remembering how he himself had handed the new recruit a broom, he added that he had also shoved the broom at him, and if he died, he would follow him. A small argument broke out between the hunters. The chief shook his head incredulously, repeatedly wondering what the Thunder Emperor had forgotten in their guild. The young partner confusedly excused that he didn't know who he was or he wouldn't have made him get out. The warden nodded, reasoning that since the Thunder Emperor had revealed his identity before leaving, they were unlikely to meet him again. And the young partner, sighing indignantly, admitted that, frankly, it was even a pity, and said with a chuckle that he wanted to get his autograph. The young partner thought, imagining how their guild would change if one of the 12 apostles were to join their ranks. What would their missions be like, and how would it affect their reputation? The thought seemed both frightening and exciting at the same time. The head of the Happy Together Guild shouted at him angrily, explaining to him that this wasn't the point. His subordinate recoiled in bewilderment, and mouthed why the boss had gotten so angry so suddenly, adding that he had almost slapped him in the face. The guild leader exclaimed if he realized how dangerous the mission was. The man only grinned in response and admitted that he understood perfectly. They had almost died right there. Thought the boss, how dare he even say such a thing? The distortion of the gate was due to the difference in the mana levels of the hunters, which caused the anomaly and the opening of the gate. So it was definitely the rookie's fault. The guild leader chimed in that being around the Thunder Emperor meant constantly risking his life. He added that he had a family to feed and couldn't afford such a risk. The partner strongly objected to hiring this person. He irritably said that there was no need to shout in his face like that, otherwise people would think that he was really becoming part of the guild. The guild head clarified that he was saying this hypothetically, not meaning that such a person would actually join the guild. He doubted the Thunder Emperor would even be interested in the idea of joining their guild. The Thunder Emperor was told that there were hunters in that cruel world. However, he replied that the F-Rang were not hunters. Don't worry, he's lucky to have met me. I'll make a hunter A-Rang out of him. To do that, he first needs to master the basics. It had been a long time since they'd seen each other. They strike each other with their fist. Their faces express anger and concentration. The atmosphere is tense, creating a tense situation. The voices were getting louder, and the situation was getting hotter by the second. It seemed as if a real storm would break out. Does he even realize what he just did? What are they talking about? His voice sounded harsh, almost shrill. This place is really something, he muttered, looking around as if he couldn't believe what was happening. The editor ranted about the last draft being good. There's a lot more realism. The selfishness of the hunters makes the battlefield a living hell, and the protagonist sacrificing himself for his comrades. He paused, pondering, then nodded, confirming his thought. The despair hovering in the air impressed him. If the improvements continue like this work could reach a new level. Then Hen replied to him that the debut wouldn't be a problem. Hen sat deep in thought, eyes fixed on a single point as if he were trying to see something in the air in front of him. His face was tense and wrinkles appeared on his forehead. He was thinking about his debut. He raised his head as if suddenly realizing something important. He had heard it right, as if trying to convince himself of the debut, for this was his chance. His eyes flashed with a spark of determination. He's determined to explore even more, and at this rate, his debut is going to be awesome. He asked him what he was writing there. He stopped and asked in surprise if the man was writing down all their sins so that he could take cruel revenge later. He remembered and said with a smile that he had something for them guys. They asked in surprise what that something was, and then realized that he probably wanted to strike them with lightning. With complete fear in his voice, he exclaimed for the man to stand, for he had a family to feed, and suddenly realized that it was a gate sweep pass. Together with Yunshik, the four of them decided to go to the gate as the Happy Together Guild. It was a great decision, and they agreed to act like that. One of them asked if there were four of them together, and if he was going with them. The other said that he should shut up because it was not the right time to act like that. Hen stated at that moment that he also wanted to formally join Happy Together. Everyone was shocked at such a reaction, at such a statement. There was silence in the air. For a few seconds no one could utter a word, their faces puzzled and amazed. The guy was sitting at the entrance of the building, all absorbed in his thoughts. His gaze was directed into the void, and his expression was heavy and sad. His image was motionless. It merged with the gray shades of the surrounding space. Hen said that he needed to become a member of the Happy Together Guild for his research. Turning to the Thunder Emperor, confused, he called him Hen afterward. He understood what the other man's motive was, and tried to figure out his intentions. He understood why the man wanted to be here. However, to be honest, having a legendary hunter in the S-Rank Guild was still something unusual. After all, they would decide to accept him. The guild leader exploded and shouted, "He's a bastard. After all, he had said not long ago that you couldn't joke around with such a thing." He angrily continued to reply that he wasn't kidding either. I didn't understand why he still didn't realize how serious this was. His words were full of determination and tension, as if he was ready to act in case of further provocations. He spoke, but his thoughts drifted to the past, where he remembered how they had struggled to start their guild. He remembered how they overcame all the difficulties by uniting and believing in their dream. The 5 boys huddled together, completely unaware of what awaited them. In time, they became 10, then 20. For years they lived, enjoying life, dreaming of one day reaching the highest peaks. But said Richard, their people were leaving one by one to start living their own real lives. And over time, they just got used to the life they had. He thought that in the depths of his soul, in the very depths of his soul, did he not still dream of reaching those heights? He wanted to help, genuinely wanting to do his best. Before him now stood not one of the 12 apostles, but only a boy following his dream. The same was true for his boss. After all, that one was basically a great opportunity for the guild. He didn't think it was worth giving him another chance. At least for Jiho's sake, maybe he should have thought about it, but the doubt didn't leave him. He resolutely told them to do so. And with that thought, he stepped forward. So he also joined them not as a Thunder Emperor, but as a writer burning with his dream and Tae-hyun's gate assistant. The guild leader stood with a pensive expression, his hands covering his mouth as if he was trying to hide his thoughts or restrain his words. He stood in front of the wall where the portraits of their teammates hung. He looked at each one carefully, his gaze a mixture of pride and contemplation. He continued to stare at the portraits with his head slightly tilted, as if considering his words. His gaze was focused and his lips barely moved when he said that it was a dream. He sighed and with a slight nod of his head said that he had been persuaded and he would be with us. He greeted Hen saying welcome to the guild, newcomer. He hoped for fruitful cooperation, believing that this would be the beginning of a successful journey for all. He was confident that everything would work out and that their work together would lead to success. The assistant the guild master mentioned was a secretive man, but everyone knew that his skills and knowledge were crucial to the success of their mission. They had found him after all. He will make me a hunter A-rank. He marveled at how epic that phrase was, feeling how it left a special impression in the air. The guy asked in surprise what the guy was doing for hours. Continuing to wonder what he was doing for hours, sitting and muttering something to himself under his nose, said irritably, throwing a glance in Hen's direction. Added the other man, trying to calm his interlocutor to leave him alone. Hen thought very well, at least it affects the sale positively. He greeted them warmly, telling him welcome. They are glad to have him with them and are sure that together they can achieve a lot. He looked at him with an indignant expression, whose eyes were full of determination, as if he was prepared to face any difficulties that might come their way. It was Mr. Du Huan, a man with a serious and confident appearance, whose presence immediately attracted attention. His posture and gaze said a lot about him. He was someone who was best not to be argued with. He said he needed to have a word with the guy and asked to vacate the premises, adding that he wouldn't be long, including them, as he only needed 30 minutes. He explained that they would be compensated, to which the man replied, addressing the gentleman, that they were on their way out. And then the guards began to escort them out confidently and without further ado, directing them to the exit. The boss was addressing Hen, saying that they were finally meeting again after so many years of running away from him. Donghwan finally meets with Hyun after a long wait, feeling relieved and happy about the meeting. Hyun sat at his computer, staring intently at the screen, his fingers sliding quickly across the keyboard. He didn't even notice when the door to the office opened and Mr. Donghwan walked in. Hen finally looked away from the screen, noticing movement in the room out of the corner of his eye. He slowly removed his headphones and the muffled sounds faded away, giving way to the silence of the office. Raising his gaze, he met the steady gaze of Mr. Don Huang, who had been standing in the room for some time. Dongwon looked at Hyun and folded his hands behind his back and slowly said, "They are unfinished with one thing." After a while, Dongwon suddenly stepped closer and hugged him tightly, as if he wanted to make sure he was really here. The master inquired of Hen how he was doing. Dongwon finally pulled away from the boy, but his hands were still on Hyun's shoulders. A warm chuckle flashed in his eyes. It really had been so long since he had seen him, his Lapulka, his dear Thunder Emperor. He missed him very much and wanted to meet him very badly. He was addressing the gentleman to keep him busy as he was writing a short story. His voice was sharp like a whiplash. Dongwon exhaled in surprise, not expecting such a reaction. He thought at that moment that the boy was still as stubborn as ever. The master grinned and crossed his arms over his chest, saying confidently that he wouldn't be able to get rid of him so easily. Hyun frowned, his eyebrows twitching slightly in surprise, and he didn't immediately understand what Donghwan meant. Was it a joking threat? A friendly challenge? There was resentment in his voice, mixed with stubborn insistence. He looked at Hen and repeated that he ignored his calls, never once picked up the phone. But the guy was trying to justify himself at that moment. Hen grabbed his phone and quickly scrolled through the call list. His eyebrows raised in surprise. The master had indeed called him even deep into the night. But with a sigh and a tired expression, he didn't sleep at all. Didn't even sleep at night? The master didn't hold back his irritation, talking sharply about how if he had any way of letting him know he was alive at all, he wouldn't have to call so often. After all, he was very much worried about him. The gentleman said in a disgruntled, firm voice, so he just doesn't respect his grandfather. But Hen coldly answered him, looking straight into his eyes, that he is not my own grandfather anyway. Since they are not related by blood. Hen sighed tiredly, glanced at his grandfather and said irritably that since he had looked at him, that was enough for today. Then, turning away, he added that he had to keep writing, signaling that the conversation was over. The Lord understood everything, but still he wanted the lad to answer him one single question. Why did he suddenly decide to come back from retirement? Hen sat staring intently at the screen, completely immersed in his thoughts. He didn't even listen to the master, as if his words were just a distant background that didn't matter. Sitting on the couch, the gentleman thought about what Hen had asked about those shoes he had asked him to buy last time. His thoughts were wondering if he even remembered. Anyway, the black boot model is only 100 pieces worldwide. They were created by the partner company of their Guardians Guild. The master spoke calmly, but a shadow of smugness slipped into his voice. He held out the box to Hen, waiting for a reaction. But the boy didn't even look away. Anyway, the master was telling him that it wasn't easy. Even if he admitted it, it was horrible. He talked about how the people of the company were whispering that he was abusing his position as the head of the guild. But Hen was sitting across from him and he clearly didn't hear a single word of his mental torment. The master slowly raised his hand and placed it on the table without further ado. He looked at Hen, but the tense silence spoke for itself. Then the master thought, all right. Hen said that he needed to become a guild assistant for research. For the sake of that, he made a deal with Director Park Dae-han. But in return, he asked for the right to return as a hunter. The master hesitated, looking at Hen. He thought that with the head of the Hunters Association, after all, he had always had a complicated relationship, respect mixed with distrust. But still, why hadn't he joined the Guardians? The Lord listened to the answer, but the words made him think. Hen had said that the Guardians were too strong an organization, making it hard to find realize there. Dehuan's mind flashed to realize? The boy thought with fatigue and slight irritation that this was why the naturally strong hunters didn't understand it. How could they know anything about the lives of ordinary hunters? And this was coming from someone whose editor had nearly lost his mind from the utter unrealism of his work. The master told Hen that he needed to continue his research. If he joined the Guardians, he would get the position of heir. In response, Hen added in passing that he had already joined the guild. Grandfather squinted his eyes and turned to him. What did he just say? But Hen calmly answered him that he had already chosen another path and to put his suggestions for someone else. At that moment, the gentleman grinned, his lips subtly curving into a sly smile. He kept talking about how he seemed to have lost that round. There was no disappointment in his voice. Rather, a calm acceptance of the inevitable. It must be a really good guild if the Thunder Emperor himself had joined it. Although it could just be bought, said the Lord. And then Hen, addressing the master, said that he had just become an official participant. And he swore that if the master interfered, he would take action. To which the master promised him that he would not interfere. The master patted Hen's shoulder confidently, his hand resting on his shoulder with a light and confident gesture as if a sign of support. He was making it clear that everything was under control and he would always be able to count on him. The Lord tried to reach out to him and explain that if he came back, someone could definitely figure out who he really was. Which meant there would always be danger too. Sighing, he calmly said that he wasn't afraid of danger. Turning to Hen, the Lord said that the others might be in danger, for they were not as strong. He tried to tell him what responsibility he was taking on. He also reminded him that if anything went wrong, he would be the one to protect them. Hen sat on the monster, his posture confident but with a slight tension. Everything around him was hushed, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. And then the Thunder Emperor raised his gaze upwards. His eyes were full of determination and cold confidence, and his face expressed strength, as if he was looking not just at the sky, but at the very essence of what was happening. The Lord grinned as he looked at the lad, thinking that he hadn't yet realized the full extent of the ordeal, but that's exactly what was needed. Hen looked at the Lord at that moment with a sad expression on his face. Without giving up hope, the master kept telling him to work hard. And if things didn't work out, the doors of the Guardians were always open to him. But the stubborn Hen tried to leave and kept telling the Lord that he already had a guild. Hen spoke indignantly. his face contorted with indignation. But the Lord turned his back after closing his eyes. He stood still, fully focused on Hen's words, though his posture said he was listening attentively but not expressing emotion. It looks like he's alive again. Turning to the secretary, the gentleman wanted to know how much it would cost to buy the cafe in question. The answer he heard was about £1 billion. The gentleman, not losing his cool, turned again to the secretary. And how much would it cost to buy the publishing house? The car started slowly, its wheels rolling gently down the road, leaving a thin trail on the asphalt. The secretary stood outside the building, holding the phone to his ear. His face remained calm, but there was a firm confidence in his voice. He said clearly, looking off into the distance, that he was sure. Holding up the newspaper, running his eyes over the headlines, he muttered about Hyun being with Du Hwan. The outraged head of the Scorpions Guild talked about meeting with the director of the association with Du Hwan, while remaining a Efrang hunter. He mumbled thoughtfully, reading the text as he spoke, because Du Hwan treated him like a grandson. A cold-blooded, unapproachable old man. Suddenly so close? His meeting was a surprise to everyone. He kept thinking that maybe those rumors about the secret grandson were really true. Someone radioed in that the target had decided to leave the cafe and was told to proceed with the mission. The group was already ready for action, but suddenly there was a sharp order to stop moving immediately. The plan had changed. The kid they were going to finish off was now off target. The wheels of the car sharply snapped out of place, glittering on the asphalt, leaving a trail of bright sparks behind them. At the same instant, the glasses flew into the air, spinning in slow motion, reflecting the flashes of light. They hovered for only a few seconds, but it was enough to make the moment stick in the memory before the glasses fell to the ground with a thud. It seems that Du Hwan's grandson was killed. The secretary ran out of the building, his face was pale and his breath was hitched with excitement. He stopped abruptly on the threshold, looking around and without restraining his emotions, and shouted, his grandson was killed. The man was rushing down the street, his footsteps sounding loud and his face contorted with despair. He didn't stay, shouting as he went as if he had nothing to do with it. But his voice echoed as if he were trying to convince not only those around him but himself as well. They talked with a chuckle about how there wasn't going to be a wet spot left of him. Hen's shadow suddenly appeared in front of the car's windshield, his silhouette startling them. One of them whispered, unable to believe his eyes, this can't be happening. But the shadow continued to move toward them to meet them as if defying the laws of reality, leaving behind only a sense of the impossible. Unable to understand what was happening, each of them had a mixture of fear and bewilderment in their eyes. Their eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them could not hide his emotion and fear and could not understand what was happening as the other said that he was the Efrang's assistant. But he answered the other, clearly annoyed that he knew nothing, and told him to finish him off. As he regained consciousness, he suddenly exclaimed in surprise and turned around sharply, talking about where the car had suddenly appeared from. Then he sighed, remembering his mother's words that she had told him not to cross the road while staring at his phone. But those two from the car were determined and aggressive, and they started attacking Hen. It was fast and violent. Lightning flashed across one of the men's faces, sharp as a foretaste of something even more violent. He looked at the boy with cold calculation, his eyes glittering with hatred. The Lightning Emperor stood in the center of the battlefield, his eyes glittering like the roars of a thunderstorm, and in his hands he clutched a lightning bolt as a weapon. At that moment, his body was filled with energy, and as soon as he took a step, a bright flash of light surged around him. The two men were thrown back by a powerful lightning strike. Their bodies like dolls were tossed faintly into the air and fell sharply to the pavement. The Thunder Emperor stood against the dark sky, his gaze cold and uncompromising. Lightning flashed from his eyes like a living entity ready to destroy everything in its path. The Thunder Emperor gradually returned to the role of a simple guy. An expression of shock froze in his eyes, and his breathing was hitching. He looked around him as if trying to realize what had just become reality and couldn't believe what had happened. Anxiety clenched in his chest. This world never seemed to be the same as he had seen it before. He survived so that no one would see it. He also wondered if it was Mr. Du Hwan. Hen stood still, his gaze staring off into the distance where, like a shadow, the vanishing car disappeared into the distance. The thought of the Sword Emperor flashed through his mind. The boy wondered who would have thought it, that old man could be useful sometimes. He watched the men lying on the pavement and thought about the fact that they were both clearly hunters. But then why did they attack him, he thought. The thought never left his mind. He was going to ask Mr. Dehan. Later, an ambulance arrived with a sharp siren blast. Its doors instantly swung open. Hastily, coherently, the medics began to take out the victims, carefully placing them on stretchers. Everything happened at that moment quickly and professionally. His voice was sincerely regretful, but it was too late to change anything. He tried to apologize to Hen and he was sorry for what had happened. But he also knew that those two had been reckless, but he didn't think so. For what it's worth, he thought those guys were out of line anyway. Hyun asked the head of the Korean Association, Park Jae-han, did he know those guys? But he replied that he did, even too much, going on to say the kind of infamous scumbags everyone knows. Hen froze in place, his eyes widening in surprise. Did the head of the Korean Association know the people who tried to kill him? Such a thought flashed through his mind like an explosion. Park Jae-han's gaze was fixed on Hong, and his face reflected a rare moment of weakness. His usually stern features softened, and his eyes dimmed with inner turmoil. He spoke of the fact that the bandits who had attacked were members of the Scorpion Guild. In the past few years, they have earned a dangerous reputation. But after Hen resigned, they were the ones who helped the Korean Association when they were in financial difficulties. Their leader's name was Cho Jin-nam. He was known for his unscrupulous means to an end. Not long ago he had an appointment, but for Hen's sake he had postponed it. Maybe now it was his revenge. Since he couldn't do anything with the chairman of the association, he targeted Hen, who was registered as a F-rank hunter. The chairman sighed regretfully. Perhaps he shouldn't have accepted help from such a person to begin with. Hen said with a slight expression on his face that it was no big deal. And the head of the Korean Association, upon hearing Hen's words, instinctively covered his face with his hand, hiding his emotions. He could barely contain his emotions and his face was tense, his eyes expressing worry and sadness. He paused for a moment before he said the words, and there was an undercurrent of pain in him that just being around him made my heart jump out of my chest. His body was very tense, every muscle seemed to clench. It seemed that the inner tension was ready to burst out, but he held himself back, trying to hide his weakness. Just then, the Thunder Emperor suddenly appeared in front of the head. His figure was majestic and his aura seemed to fill the space around him. The head of the association froze, his tense body instantly betraying an internal struggle. Not expecting such an appearance, he clearly felt the presence of power and threat in the air, trying to calm Hen down with words. The Thunder Emperor stood with a dispassionate expression on his face, his gaze fixed forward. He thought that if someone harmed the guild he had joined, they would suffer greatly. He continued to speak as well, assuring the head of the association to calm down. After all, it's amazing. Thunder Emperor then said with a chuckle that this was the peak of realism. The competition among the hunters doesn't stop even outside the gate, and if you get in their way, they might just attack. The head of the association glanced indignantly at the Thunder Emperor, thinking about what kind of nonsense he was talking about. There was a mixture of both surprise and amazement in his eyes. He couldn't understand why the latter was so calmly talking about such dangers, when the protagonist would finally manage to overcome such difficulties and grow up. The Emperor thought about it, grinning as he imagined how exciting such a sight would be. There was a glint of curiosity in his eyes, as if he had already seen how things would unfold. He was telling Park Jae-han that he didn't need to do anything because he didn't mind things staying as they were. The head of the association and his secretary looked at Hen with surprised looks. They were both stunned and without hiding their surprise, muttered that indeed he would agree. With admiration, Hen said yes and added that things would get more interesting from then on. His eyes shone as if anticipating something incredible. The head of the Scorpion Guild, Cho Jin-nam, shouted in rage that they were assholes. After all, he had ordered them to cancel the operation. His face was contorted with anger and his voice sounded with cruel determination as if he couldn't believe such carelessness. If they went on, they should have finished the job, but instead they were taken away in an ambulance and maimed, Cho Jin-nam continued to say angrily. His words were filled with contempt and disappointment. And how dare they call themselves scorpions? One of the hunters tried to justify himself by saying that Hyun seemed to have guards. After all, after the lightning strike, they were instantly vaporized. The head of the Scorpion Guild, with burning eyes, entered the fight with the hunters. His rage was unrestrained and every blow was full of anger. The guild leader looked at the hunters with utter disdain. He noticed that they whimpered from the minor shock of the current and noted that the bodyguard of this assistant was clearly not someone simple but most likely the Thunder Emperor himself. The guild leader looked at the hunters with irritation and said that they called themselves scorpions and couldn't even handle some kid. The hunters lowered their heads guiltily and began to apologize to the guild leader. The guild leader muttered that he didn't care since they were useless anyway. The guild head shouted angrily that now they didn't need to think about the brat, but if he really was Du Hwan's grandson, he definitely wouldn't be left out. Du Hwan himself is the leader of one of Korea's 4 largest guilds, the Guardians. His powerful figure and determined gaze showed that he was not a person to be joked with. He thought what's done is done. Even if they stop now, nothing will change. He asked what guild that helper was in. The other replied that he was from Happily Together and her rank was C. The guild leader said that they would buy all of their gate orders. He also ordered him to make sure there were no guilds left for him to work for. The guild leader was furious and said that since it had gotten this far, they would do the right thing. Then, with a cold glint in his eyes, he added that they would kidnap someone from his family. The girl left the room, her footsteps quiet but sure. For a moment she paused at the door as if hesitating. She remarked with a smile that the world had indeed changed for the better. Now even ice cream could be bought in the middle of the night. In her mind she was going over what to watch when she got home. She walked along the dark road, leisurely enjoying the cool air of the night, still looking at her phone. Somewhere behind her she heard soft footsteps, steady and almost imperceptible. Someone was following her, staying in the shadows. One shouted to the other that they had captured her. And then the girl tried to break free in a panic, her voice breaking the silence of the night. But the street was deserted and only the echo of her scream echoed off the walls of the nearest buildings. In a dimly lit room, a girl was kneeling on the cold concrete floor. Her hands were roughly bound and a tight sack was pulled over her head, hiding her face. It was stuffy under the sack, the fabric unpleasant against her skin, and her heart was pounding in her chest. Her thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear, she'd been kidnapped. She couldn't believe what was happening, it seemed completely absurd to her. She kept thinking she had been kidnapped and tears rolled down her cheeks. The car drove slowly away from the place, its wheels leaving tracks on the dusty road. Behind her, the familiar scenery was fading, and a light haze of exhaust fumes hung in the air. Ahead was a two-story house rising behind a high fence. Its walls were sturdy and imposing, with windows, and there was greenery of shrubs and trees all around. In the dim light of the lamp, several men surrounded the girl whose hands were bound. One of them, with a cold stare, stepped closer, leaned over her and began interrogating her, demanding answers. The others watched in silence. Guild head Scorpion grinned and coldly said that no matter how powerful Du Huan was, he wouldn't stop their plans. The girl was sitting on a chair, her wrists bound with a coarse rope. Muffled voices came through the thick fabric of the bag that concealed her face. It flashed through her mind that he could not have foreseen such a situation. The guild leader frowned, realizing that the S-Rang was not just a hunter, but a creature whose powers were beyond human capabilities. And what to speak of Du Huan, for any of the Guardian Guild captains alone could wipe them out. But if the rumors of his boundless love for his grandson are true, even Du Huan himself will turn out to be just an ordinary man just like them. With a relative as a hostage, Du Huan wouldn't be able to fight at full strength. All that was left was to tighten the noose, use the Scorpion Guild, and get whatever they wanted. This was their chance. If they seized the opportunity and influenced the Guardians from behind the scenes, the Scorpion Guild could become the most powerful guild in South Korea. He said with a chuckle as he looked at the kidnapped woman. He looked at the girl with curiosity and a cold chuckle, noting that he had never once heard that Du Huan had a granddaughter as well. He grinned then and noted that it was worth at least checking to see if it was indeed true. The bag that concealed her face was removed and her gaze, full of fear, was directed into the void. The glasses she wore came off her nose and fell to the floor, their panes gleaming in the dim light of the room. The guild leader continued to stare at the girl. His gaze was cold and impartial, as if assessing her with some hidden purpose. There was no emotion or pity in his eyes, only calculation and cold vengeance. Later, he covered the sack over the girl's face again, his hands acting confidently and without delay. The sack rested tightly against her face, hiding her expression of fear and despair, leaving her in darkness and isolation. The head of the guild, Scarlet Flame, shouted. His voice rang out like thunder in the silence, and with each letter of the word, his face became even more furious. It was as if a bolt of lightning ran through the air. The bag that was over the girl's head suddenly burst into flames. The flames engulfed it with a bright, dangerous fire, and it blazed brightly. And then she tore the ropes that bound her hands with a frenzied rage, and with a sharpened gaze, shouted. What did he mean about Du Huan? The Scorpion Guild head abruptly flew backwards, his body shaking from the impact. However, despite the pain, he reprimanded her as she stood. His voice was full of anger and authority. Turning to him, she noticed that the head of the Scorpion Guild had some business with their leader. She laughed and looked at him and turned to him and said that she had never been kidnapped before and wondered what would happen next. She went on to tell him that she wished it was more fun. With a loud laugh, someone uttered that finally that very day had come. The guy was addressing the newcomer to watch carefully, or else he would show him today who was the toughest in their guild. The newcomer stared at him in amazement, thinking how casually he said such things as if he were a comic book protagonist himself or something. He seemed weirder every day. Ugh. Why is panic already rising inside? The guild leader and his partner stood in a daze, their faces reflecting shock. Their eyes widened, their breathing hitched, they couldn't believe what was happening. He looked at them gratefully and said with relief that he was glad to be accepted. He said that coming to them had been the right decision. Man Sasung remarked with a smile that it was rather they who should be thanking him. And at that moment, Hyung wondered what they were talking about. One of them exclaimed with utter delight that they were going to the gate. And this was only possible because of the clearance he had managed to get. To be honest, they had their own pride, so they tried to knock out the gate on their own. But the Scorpion Guild bought the orders right out from under their noses. Hen thought in surprise, looking in front of him. They said it was Scorpius doing. The head of the Happy Together Guild asked Hen if he knew them. But the boy replied that he didn't. He didn't know if he had done something wrong, but the feeling was eerie. With obvious relief, he shouted for the chief to be on his way. His blood was boiling with rage. He turned to see that someone was walking beside him. Hen took off his glasses, putting them carefully in his pocket. His face was a little more serious, his eyes clearer and more determined. He was silent as if preparing for something important and only sighed. Hen kept thinking about how they were going to play out that situation and his heart filled with sadness. A slight sadness reflected in his soul, as if he already knew how it would end. He pulled out his phone and looking at the screen, his face became even more grim. His eyes reflected a deep, tired look. He saw something that only his sense of hopelessness. He saw a message on the screen that instantly robbed him of his strength. His sister had been kidnapped. His heart clenched, and for a moment the world around him seemed to darken. Everything became unimportant except for that shocking revelation. Unable to take his eyes off the screen, reading every word of the correspondence. Each new message seemed to fall on his soul like a heavy stone. His heart clenched as he realized his sister was in danger. The door creaked open and shadows from the corridor began to fill the room. There was silence in the air, as if the whole world had frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The sudden impact shook the room, and the air seemed to thicken, becoming heavy. One by one, people began to lose their balance. Some collapsed to their knees, some fell to the floor before they could grab onto anything. The room was in chaos. He shifted his gaze to the head of the guild, waiting for an explanation. So he didn't understand what was wrong, and his voice trembled with tension. One of the guild members begged him to leave, but the girl sharply shouted at him, telling him to get out and not to try that again. Hen stepped forward, glaring at the one who was leaving, and coldly said that it was a disgrace to grovel before a girl like that. One of the Scorpion Guild disdainfully remarked that the S-rank girl was only nominally a S-rank girl, but in reality she was just a pretty person. And he suggested that if they attacked her together, they would be able to pull it off. However, guild leader Scorpion himself shouted for everyone to be quiet and reminded them that Scarlet Flame was in front of them. Wherever she appeared, only ash remained behind her. Every gate she entered burned so hot that the heat could be felt even at the entrance. She was a fire mage, specializing in mass spells, which was a rarity among hunters. Guild leader Scorpius irritatedly addressed his subordinates. Did they really think that being attractive was enough to get S rank? Did they think they were lucky to get off so lightly? He pondered with rage and a cigarette in his teeth how things had gone so wrong, and who would have thought Scarlet Flame was Du Huan's granddaughter. The leader of the Scorpion Guild had originally only intended to teach the stubborn assistant a lesson. However, after the failed attempt, he vowed to retreat temporarily, but in the future, he would make the offender answer for everything. Guild head Scorpius invited his subordinates to approach him. When Scarlet Flame entered the room, all eyes immediately turned to her. The faces of those present expressed surprise and admiration, and some even stepped back as they felt the unbearable heat. The head of the Scorpion Guild suddenly noticed that the girl known as Scarlet Flame was not going to leave. He offered her a ride home out of fear, but she refused, saying it wasn't that. Scarlet Flame changed her mind about letting the members of the Scorpion Guild go. With a flick, she summoned a spark of flame, illuminating the room with an ominous light. Everyone present froze in shock, unable to believe what was happening. Their eyes widened, their faces turned pale, and their bodies were petrified with horror at its power. Everyone around me was screaming, "Why? What's going on?" Screams echoed in the room, reflecting the growing panic. A sense of imminent danger hung in the air, causing hearts to beat faster. Scarlet Flame noted that this was the first time Hen had asked her for a favor, and she was curious enough that she decided to find out what it was all about. At that moment, the head of the Scorpion Guild thought that those guys had decided to bully his brother. He continued to wonder if they had done this to themselves. Scarlet Flame grinned, uttering that it was her prerogative to mock an eye. In the dusky sky, bright lightning illuminated a two-story house with a tall fence, casting harsh shadows. The girl walked slowly forward with her head bowed. Her long hair hid her face, Her shoulders were slumped, and her gait expressed deep sadness. Flames of scarlet flames flickered behind her back. The fire seemed to follow her, reflecting her inner torment and pain. Suddenly she felt the flames on her body intensify and looked around in surprise to find her trail of fire forming bizarre patterns on the ground. She stopped, contemplating this unusual phenomenon. Scarlet Flame felt her flame intensify and suddenly felt like a comic book heroine, savoring the moment of her power and uniqueness. The members of the Scorpion Guild lay on their hospital beds, covered in bandages and with an expression of exhaustion on their faces, emphasizing the fragility of their condition after the incident with Scarlet Flame that led to the collapse of their guild. An unprecedented incident known as the S-Rang abduction took place in South Korea, and that incident shocked the country, causing widespread public outcry and media discussion. Some wondered if this was a new kind of suicide, given the risk and difficulty of kidnapping someone from the S-Rang, especially someone as powerful as Scarlet Flame. Others, perhaps from the A-Rang Guild, suggested that their colleagues were too relaxed and had not expected such an outcome. His eyes widened in surprise at what the same guy had written on the screen. At the same time, on another phone correspondence, Hen apologizes that he can't send the material, will surely send it to him tomorrow. He felt the tension building and realized it was time to act. The boy hesitated, feeling the bewilderment overwhelm him. A thought flashed through his mind: who were they to ask so directly? And then Hen thought and answered him. Did he really want to know who they were? The girl clenched her fists, her face spread into a joyful smile, and she looked at him intently as if proud of his determination. He turned to his sister to say please, but she replied to him that there would be no such thing. He's already been delayed in sending stuff out because of those guys from the Scorpion Guild. He thought that this time he was also distracted by that gorilla. His sister grabbed him sharply by the neck for calling her a gorilla. Her eyes glittered with rage. She squeezed with force, as if trying to squeeze all the words out of him that he had just spoken. Everything around him seemed to freeze, only her breathing and pulse were audible in the silence. And he was trying to tell her everything at that moment. Their guild has become a true force that cannot be ignored, and every step they take brings them closer to the top. They mock their guild mercilessly, taunting and humiliating its members as if taking pleasure in someone else's defeat. Hen fell to his knees with his head bowed, and his sister stood in front, trying to hold out her hands in a gesture of help. She stood over him, and he was absorbed in his own thoughts, kneeling and with a slight chuckle on his face sighing. He said he almost died before the book was released. Scarlet Flame, without taking her eyes off him, asked him with concern in her voice, what did he mean when he said he almost died before the book was released? There was a mixture of bewilderment and excitement in her voice, as if she were trying to figure out what hidden meaning lay behind his words. He said he didn't want to make a fuss, so he offered to keep things between them. She quickly ran out of the room, and he, screaming, tried to stop her, but she wouldn't stop. He said with annoyance that damn gorilla, and for Tae-hyun and Tae-seo to shut up and eat. He arrived and was greeted with surprise. In his hands he held something that had been given to him by his parents. He didn't forget to thank for being accepted into the guild. However, he said that thanking wasn't worth it because really gratitude should be on their part. The boss was asleep, so the conversation had to be postponed until later. Eun-shik said he would come later because he had some things to take care of. Still, everyone decided to wait. Hen heard the question about the recent Scorpion kidnapping incident. He replied in a calm voice that he had heard, confirming that he was aware of the events. The conversation continued, and one of them remarked that the news was terrific. It is awesome, Hen wrote in his notebook, but it's just too bad they tried to intercept their sweep. For a moment he hesitated and with a slight doubt thought that admitting it was his fault. His voice sounded calm, as if he had already made up his mind that he had given it some thought. He pondered, observing what was happening. Even if the frames were different, they were still all connected somehow. He began to wonder if it was a coincidence. Something told him that there was some reason behind it. He continued to ponder, unable to shake off his anxiety. After all, it was very strange that the Scorpions, one of the most successful guilds in the A-Rang, all of a sudden they decided to take away their rights to sweep the gate. It seemed kind of strange. They even went to the unprecedented step of kidnapping S-Rank girl. They continued to discuss the incident, exchanging many hypotheses. In the end, all agreed that such a situation requires attention and careful investigation. It flashed through Hen's mind before he realized that the blame lay with him. And then he wondered, what if they told him to leave the guild? After all, he could pose a threat to them. When you add it all up, there is only one conclusion to be drawn, as he has found himself in the spotlight of it all, and now his decisions could change everything. He came over and looked at him, and with a slight rebuke, said he was small and knew how things worked. Hen stood opposite, head slightly bowed, his gaze firm but with an ineffable mixture of doubt and determination slipping into it. Hen cried, begging not to be kicked out and promising that it wouldn't happen again. He shouted happily that they would soon be rich. But also at that moment he thought, why would such high-ranking hunters start a war? Any way you look at it, there's only one reason, and it's the truth. He realized that the reason for everything was because there were untold treasures hidden inside the gate they were about to defend. He thought about how lucky they were. Because now that the scorpions were no longer a threat, they had regained the right to mop up. And now there was only one thing left to do: get rich. The voice was irritated, not happy that the naughty boy was keeping him awake again. As luck smiled on them, the conversation turned to riches. One of them asked curiously what kind of treasure there was. The boss only sighed irritably, grumbling why he had woken up in the first place. He said confidently that it was a worthwhile gate. The boss sighed, thinking, and then glanced at Hen, waved his hand and said that since he was here, there was no need to delay. He had to get to the bottom of that case because he had a job ahead of him. One of the heads of the Happy Together Guild grinned and said that once they took the treasure, they could forget about his miserable job as a mercenary. In return, Man Sa-sung confirmed to him that that was exactly what would happen. He exhaled a sigh of relief, a flicker of thought that he already thought was the end. At 24 minutes past 12, he received a text message asking him to discuss the material he had sent that morning. The caller asked if he had time to talk. He looked at the phone and thought about the fact that it was 100% feedback. He looked back and heard a familiar voice coming from behind him. His heart beat faster, the intonation all too recognizable. At first he enjoyed reading the book. He noticed that the author had greatly improved the style and depth of the characters since the contract termination conversations. Hen was very happy and began to thank, but at the same time he thought that despite all the improvements, the shortcomings had still changed. The editor asked him to give an example to better understand the deficiencies in question. He told Hen that the moment when the main character becomes a hunter in range will be pivotal to his development and relationship with those around him. The editor looked at Hyun and, waiting for his response, continued with the thought that his text had become much more realistic, more interesting to read. But there was something that needed improvement. He also went on to say that the plot has become too routine. Due to the lack of meaningful events that would make the character develop, that's why the work doesn't progress. The editor added that usually the protagonist starts off as a normal character. But as time goes on and he goes through battles and trials, he becomes stronger. He also continued that readers draw parallels to the character's growth story and feel the climax more deeply and fully. Hen reflected on the growth story. The editor, noticing his reflection, replied that it was absolutely true. He also reflected, remembering the editor's words that even the 12 apostles were not perfect from the beginning, going on to say that they were tempered by hardships that gradually turned them into heroes of our time, thanks to this progress. That's why people like them. Their strength, confidence, and cohesion were admirable. The editor replied to him that of course he had heard of the Thunder Emperor who was born with great power. At that moment, a feeling flashed through Hen's mind that he didn't understand anything yet. The only thing the editor wanted Hen to point out was that it was time for the main character to grow up. Hen thought about the editor's words. His eyes clouded over, and his thoughts swallowed him up like a thick fog. He was silent, his mind swarming with ideas, but he couldn't put them together. He thought that in the next chapter he would need to describe a scene of a trial that his character would become stronger after passing. He felt it would be an important moment of character growth. The editor, after listening carefully, agreed with his idea. Exactly what was needed for the next event. He glanced at his watch and regretfully noticed that time was running out. The editor apologized to Hen, saying he had to leave early because of the meeting. In return, Hen thanked him for the feedback. Before I left, the editor added the phrase, just before I left, he informed me of something else. What is growth for a writer? I was hoping he'd think about it. Hen nodded silently, processing the words in his head, because that's where the main character's journey begins. He sat pensive and his thoughts focused on the next step in the story, and he realizes that this is where his character's journey of growth begins. Such a moment is more pivotal, like the beginning of something big and meaningful. Two men stand back to back, surrounded by monsters. One with a sword, the other with a magical artifact, ready to fight. The fog creates an atmosphere of tension, the moment of their growth where each monster is a step towards development. In the dark room, the tapping of keys is barely audible. The computer screen illuminates his focused face, reflecting the flickering lines of text. The air is silent, broken only by the occasional click of the mouse. He sat with his chin resting on his hand, staring thoughtfully at the screen. The light of the monitor illuminated his face, reflecting concentration and intense thought. He posted on a forum for writers that he didn't know how to describe the hero's growth from rang to in-rang. He stared at the screen for a while, waiting for an answer, going over the possible options in his head. Then he thought, what if he just made him stronger after training? He was angry with hunger and thought that such a text was not enough, as internal growth was also needed. Typing on his keyboard, he thoughtfully asked, what does internal growth even mean? Hungry with a churning stomach, he tried to think of something sensible to do, but the thought stubbornly slipped away. The computer screen popped up, which is a little hard to describe in words, but it usually has to do with overcoming a trauma or resolving an internal conflict. Hungry and irritated, he pounded furiously at the keys, trying to figure out what it meant to help a friend overcome difficulties to develop characters together. His thoughts were jumbled, and he couldn't concentrate. He sat in the dark room, staring thoughtfully at the computer screen. His hunger reminded him of himself, but his mind was on other things. But the thought flickered in his voice that he had no idea what they were talking about. He wondered if watching a comrade's growth was something he could do. With a smile, he said that if he needed to observe the height of a comrade, Hen's mind was in chaos, ideas were jumbled together. Suddenly his attention was caught by a picture on the screen. A tense hunting scene was taking place where a huge beast was furiously attacking one of the hunters. The hunters lined up in a line and held their defenses against the huge beast that was fiercely attacking their position. One of them shouted loudly for them to keep their formation, as in such cases it was necessary to keep formation to effectively resist the attack of a large beast. A huge beast with an open mouth and sharp claws rushed at the hunters, causing them to react instantly. But the hunters did not give up and surrounded the huge beast, preparing for the decisive moment. A huge beast with an open maw and huge eyes attacking one of the hunters was furiously creating sounds. He attacked the hunter, grabbing his sword in his huge paws. But the hunter didn't give up, gritting his teeth and saying, I'm sorry, but I'll win anyway. The hunter surrounded by the beast did not give in. He tried his best to wrest the sword from the beast's huge clutches. The struggle continued and the outcome was unpredictable. Sun Ho Young Shik and another hunter were armed with spears and swords, fighting the giant beast with determination and aggression in their eyes. Strengthening their morale, the hunters act cohesively. They sought to prevail over a mighty foe. Hen's journal recorded how the huge beast, with a fierce growl, desperately resisted the hunters trying to tie him up. He threw them away, not allowing them to approach. However, despite its resistance, the hunters kept trying to tie it up. But the beast did not give up, desperately defending its freedom. With tears in his eyes, he couldn't think of what to write next. He noticed that he had been using the same strategy for weeks on end without any noticeable progress or development. The editor had warned him earlier that they might terminate the contract if the current pace of work continued. And so that dreadful day came for him. The hunters laid down the huge beast in a coordinated manner. One of them, looking at his team, praised them for their teamwork. The guild head of the Happy Together Guild, Man Sa-song, turned around and inquired, what about their new guy? He saw Hyan kneeling on his knees, begging and bowing his head to the ground, telling him not to cancel his contract. Man Sa-sung didn't understand what was happening to the guy. At the end of a long day, when the team of hunters had finished their chores, the partner shouted to his boss that since we were done for the day, then let's go home. Did the guild leader remind them that they hadn't forgotten anything? He reminded them of the distribution of the week's income. He thought that the distribution of the guild's income was very important, but at that moment he hesitated. At that moment, his partner reminded him with a smile that he was talking about Hen's homecoming and enrollment party. He noted that it would soon be week 4 and it was time to celebrate. Man Sa-song remembered the upcoming rookie party and felt a surge of joy. He was looking forward to such an event, which would be a bright end to their work week. He apologized, informing them that he was very busy. Walking away without turning around, he added, guys, that could be put off until next time. The three of them stood, their faces reflecting a deep sadness. The three hunters were standing side by side. And then, the partner, noticing the silence of the boss, tried to ask him if everything was all right. The chief told him that he was not and continued to remain silent. The thought never left his mind that he was the head of the family. And he continued on his way, absorbed in his thoughts, while the shadows of the trees flickered across his path. He was riding on the streetcar. The images of the past days, the moments he couldn't forget, flashed through his mind. The outside world seemed to dissolve. Only the inner dialogue remained. where every word echoed. The streetcar continued on its way, and he kept thinking and thinking, trying to find the answers to the questions that kept bothering him. He walked into the book section of the mall, and upon picking up one of the books, he experienced a profound surprise. Then he went to a flower store, intending to buy a potted plant or a bouquet. But after weighing all the pros and cons, he decided to opt for a more familiar and unpretentious bouquet that would easily fit into his daily life. With this decision, he headed to the cash register to pay for the book and the bouquet. Satisfied with his choice, he felt light and calm, as if he had made the right move. He left the store with a satisfied expression on his face, holding a bag of books and a bouquet of flowers. And so the boss stood facing the hospital, his face expressing determination and calmness. He knew that his actions could make a difference, and he was ready for the challenges ahead. He stood in front of the room, his gaze drawn inward, where a small child with a pale face sat on a whitewashed bed, surrounded by medical devices, and a young woman was beside him. Her face reflected a mixture of worry and immense love. She held his small hands gently, as if trying to convey her strength and support. The little boy saw his daddy with a happy face. His eyes lit up and his lips spread into a big smile. He stretched out his arms to hug his daddy. The room had a warm and cozy atmosphere filled with family happiness. Manhwa stood at the door and asked his son with a smile how he was doing. As he approached him, he noticed his satisfied face and heard the boy proudly announce that he had eaten every last crumb. He then praised his son, expressing his admiration for his appetite and integrity. The father's happiness and pride were evident. He praised his son and said that a good boy deserves a reward. He took a modern fiction book out of the bag and handed it to his son. On the cover was a scene from a movie about hunters where the heroes faced dangerous situations in the wilderness. The little boy, with full of excitement, holding the book, asked his father, "This is the book about what not to do in hunter movies, isn't it?" He fulfilled his son's dream by giving him a book about common mistakes made by hunters in movies. Smiling, he said, "That's right, son. She talks about the mistakes hunters make in the movies and what they teach them." The son thanked his father with utter delight and said he was the best. Manhwa did not forget about his wife. Addressing her fondly, he expressed his gratitude for her care and support. He told her that her love and devotion made their family stronger, and he handed her a beautiful bouquet, saying, "This is for you, dear." She was very surprised at his surprise. Her eyes lit up with happiness, and she answered him with a warm smile, confirming that their bond and mutual support were the foundation of their marital happiness. After all, with his attention, he reminded her that it was their wedding anniversary. She looked at him with a smile and told her lover how pleased she was. But it was very sad that they both completely forgot about her. Manhwa addressed his wife fondly and said, "Beloved." His warm words emphasized their closeness and relationship. The boy watched his parents. With what tenderness his father hugged his mother, expressing his love and support. The son turned to his parents. He was trying to ask them something. The embarrassed parents looked at their son with interest, expecting him to ask a question. The little boy was passionately reading the book his father had given him. Suddenly, the boy became ill and developed a nosebleed. The parents were horrified when they noticed that something strange was happening to their child and began to worry about possible serious causes for this condition. The parents stood in the hospital room where their son Ji-ho was lying. The father and mother tried to keep their composure, but unable to hide the trembling in their voices, spoke softly to Ji when they saw that he was losing consciousness. "The child is lying in the intensive care ward, connected to a ventilator." The mother pressed her clenched hands to her lips, holding back tears and holding her son's hand. Meanwhile, the father was talking to the doctor. The doctor informed the father that their son Ji-ho has a rare disease related to his magic powers. His condition would worsen with each passing year as his magic powers grew stronger. He was shocked by this news and didn't know how to help his child. The doctor, realizing the complexity of the situation, felt it was necessary to perform the operation as soon as possible. The father, holding back his emotions, recognized the gravity of the situation, but his look betrayed a deep concern and love for his son. The doctor offered to prepare everything necessary to perform the surgery at any time, pending the parents' decision on whether to proceed. Clenching his hands tightly into fists as if they were two pebbles, he mouthed back to the doctor that, "Okay, we should get started immediately." He thought about the fact that he would have to take out a loan again, and if he couldn't, he would try to find more work and earn money. He stood to the side, his gaze fixed on her, reflecting concern and a desire to help. The space around them was empty, emphasizing their isolation and despair. Manhwa slowly approached her, his footsteps quiet so as not to disturb her. He stopped beside her and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Wiping away her tears, he told her not to worry about the money, he would get it. He assured her that he would take care of the medical bills, in an effort to relieve her of her financial worries during such a difficult time. His words were full of determination and love. And in that moment, my son whispered, "Daddy," when they both turned to their son, and in a blink of an eye asked about his well-being. The atmosphere was filled with anxiety and concern. Turning to his parents, Ji-ho, being under the machine, with difficulty whispered through the mask, "Mom, Dad." His parents, hearing his faint voice, immediately approached, their hearts filled with hope and anxiety. The father, holding back his excitement, gently asked his son how he was feeling and told him not to worry, everything was over and they were close by. The baby apologized for scaring them so much. His mother, holding back tears, gently stroked his head and told him that everything was fine. Turning to him with love, she continued to say that the doctor had helped him and now he was under reliable protection. The child, feeling guilty about his illness, said quietly that he should not have gotten sick. The father, with love and care, told him not to say that again. The illness was not his fault. He continued to say quietly under his mask that if it wasn't for him, they wouldn't have to suffer so much. His words struck his parents and they were very much disturbed. The mother and father, with eyes full of tears, leaned toward their own son. They asked him not to say that anymore because it was not his fault. They were with him because they loved him and wanted him to get better quickly. His presence was their joy, not a cause of suffering. They kept telling their son that he had nothing to apologize for at all. The mother bowed her head to Ji-ho, saying that they should be the ones to apologize to him. The father, unable to hold back tears, promised his son that he and his mom would do everything they could to make sure he would never be hurt again. He concluded that they would help him get back on his feet, no matter what the difficulties. There was a tense silence. The mother knelt in front of her son's bed, head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The father stood turned away, clenching his fists. Mansa's son stands in line in front of the building, perhaps waiting for the bank to open. He stood in a long line, the time dragged agonizingly slow. The hour-long wait made him feel annoyed and helpless. And here he was sitting across from the specialist, his face expressing anxiety and worry. She looked at him and told him apologetically that he already had unpaid debts. Such words echoed heavily in his soul. He was concerned that taking out a loan would not work out for him and he had no other choice. Other than working as a mercenary, nothing had crossed his mind. Mansa-song sat on the log with his head down and deep in thought. His face reflected heavy thoughts and worries, and his shoulders were slumped slightly from inner tension. At that moment, his partner came up to him and said that he had done a good job. In response, Mansa-song looked up and smiled slightly and told him that he had done a good job too. Mansa-song's partner, noticing his hard work in the absence of his own guild, asked with a chuckle why he was working so hard there, even without his guild. Whether it was because he needed a lot of fast money. He tearfully admitted that he needed money as he needed to help someone. His partner felt a deep sense of well-being upon hearing this. He knew that Mansa-song was always willing to come to the rescue even at the cost of his own efforts. He wanted to ask him for money as he was experiencing financial difficulties. When he heard about 200 million, his partner was stunned. His eyes widened in surprise and his mouth dropped open slightly as he tried to comprehend what he had heard. The pause lengthened before he could speak. He reminded him that even S-rank hunters didn't make that kind of money. Mansa-song, in turn, was aware of the amount of the reward and was willing to make every effort to complete the task successfully. His partner was thinking. He stood with his head slightly lowered and his gaze more focused as if he was trying to comprehend what he had heard. Thoughts flashed in his eyes as he weighed the information. He knew that a lot depended on his decision, and this realization made him think carefully about every possible step. And then an idea came to him. And then he dialed the gentleman, reminding him of the conversation they'd had earlier about S-rank hunters. After the phone call with the gentleman, the partner looked depressed. He stood with his head down, his shoulders tense and his gaze fixed on the floor. Mansa-song said that it was the kind of work that paid well. His partner agreed, albeit hesitantly. Mansa-song pondered the work ahead of him, wondering about her character and the reasons why she had caught his attention. He was confident in his abilities and had no doubts. His partner explained to him that the Witches' Guild of Virang was looking for a human shield to protect them during the use of magic. However, clearing a high-level W-rank dungeon posed a serious danger to the S-rank hunters. Mansa-song learned that a successful dungeon sweep would bring in a profit of over 500 million. Since he would be the only living shield, his share would be around 100 million. Realizing the significance of the amount, he agreed. His partner understood the complexity of the situation he was in. However, he realized that the upcoming task would require him to confront dangerous monsters on his own without anyone's help. He warned him that he might die as the upcoming dungeon was the most dangerous among all the W ranks. However, Manhwa was unstoppable. He asked for help from his partner to help him get that job. In the dark dungeon lit only by flickering torches, a huge green monster stood before him. Manhwa kept thinking about how he had to get there. He's a S-rank hunter, and he'll need to hold out at all costs. Manhwa gathered all his will and determination and prepared for the upcoming fight with the huge green monster armed with a massive axe. The monster's eyes blazed with a bright firelight, reflecting a sinister glare. In his massive hands he clutched a huge axe, its blade glinting, ready to rain down on anyone who dared approach. But despite the danger, Manhwa did not give up. He gripped the tip of his sword tightly, preparing for the decisive battle with the fierce beast. His fiery eyes glittered in the darkness and his axe swung with terrible force. The fight continued with unrelenting tension. Manhwa continued to fight the fierce beast whose fiery eyes glittered in the darkness despite the fatigue and danger. His every stroke was full of determination. He knew that not only his own life but also the success of the entire mission depended on his fortitude. With each passing moment the battle grew more intense, testing the limits of his endurance and courage. His thoughts were focused on why the landlord had suddenly raised the prices of rent and deposits. His thoughts swirled around the question, trying to find an explanation for the sudden increase. He was warned that if he suddenly didn't pay by next month, he would have to move out. He realized that he could not indefinitely acquiesce to such changes. He was informed that the rent for the guild office would increase by 200,001 next month. He was alarmed by this news as the additional cost would be a serious blow to the budget. He pondered what steps to take to deal with such an unexpected financial burden. Manhwa, known in the guild by his nickname Jiho, was known for his dedication and desire to always be on the front lines. Realizing the importance of the mission, he was ready to act without delay. No matter how many difficulties he encounters along the way, let no one think that he will give up so easily. And despite the hardships, he was not going to give up and continued to fight to the end. His determination and steadfastness were unshakable and he was ready to go on until the victorious end, as he was in desperate need of money for an emergency operation. Realizing that time was short, he was prepared to do anything. His determination and willingness to take risks was dictated not only by the personal circumstances of being the head of a family, but also by the possible consequences for his team. In the midst of a fierce battle with a giant beast armed with a massive axe, Manhwa was severely injured. Fainting, his comrades in arms shouted at him to use all his mana and attack with redoubled strength. They knew that only the full utilization of his magical abilities could change the course of the battle. In that moment, his whole life seemed to flash before him. He had so hoped to defeat the monster. With tears in his eyes, he remembered his son Jiho. At that moment, his heart was filled with bitterness and determination, for he knew he had to survive for his sake. As he lost consciousness, he saw the silhouette of his son shining before him with a warm, cheerful smile. In that last vision, it seemed that his son was quietly speaking words of encouragement as if confirming that he had turned out to be something good. In those moments he reflected on his faith, feeling inept, for deep down he was searching for a higher power to help him and his son. Falling asleep in front of the monitor, Hen wondered what kind of growth could we be talking about. He thought about how his head was about to explode since it was already morning and he hadn't, not once, slept a wink. In the silence of the room, the phone suddenly rang sharply, breaking the calm and making me wince. It was Ho's son. Responding to his son, Ho said he was just about to go to work. When he heard that he was going to work, he was genuinely surprised. His eyebrows raised, his eyes widened, and his face was a mixture of bewilderment and worry. In the hospital room, where the instruments pulsed quietly, Manhwa lay on the bed, slipping into a faint consciousness. His wife was leaning over him, her face reflecting deep concern and worry. She held his hand gently, occasionally stroking his arm, trying to convey her warmth and support. Her eyes were full of tears, but she held them back, striving to be strong for him. Standing at the door, Hyun and the head of the Happy Guild discussed together that boss Manhwa had overworked his wage labor to raise money for his son's surgery. Such information surprised them a lot. He expressed his displeasure that Manhwa did not share with his co-workers, considering them as close people who could have helped him. Hen also expressed his dissatisfaction by scratching the back of his head. He thought that as close friends, they could help in a difficult situation. Hen expressed his desire to help his boss and inquired as to how much funding would be needed to support him in his situation. The guild leader rejoiced about the fact that he was the Thunder Emperor and how good it was that he had decided to support his boss. Manhwa's wife, sitting next to her husband in the hospital room, watched with surprised eyes. She admired the decision of her husband's colleagues. His face reflected deep sadness and thoughtfulness, his eyes staring off into the distance, as if he was searching for answers. He was grateful for Hen's decision, but had to refuse his help. Hen stood in utter confusion, asking the question, why? The guild head talked about how if the boss needed money, he would have asked him for it himself, but he didn't do such a thing. He thought that the situation would change, so he convinced himself to accept a new member into the guild. But he sincerely saw you not as a Thunder Emperor but as an ordinary guy, their comrade. In the guild corridor, a new recruit excitedly reported that they had contacted the guild in rank where the boss worked as a mercenary. Hearing such news, the guild leader immediately headed towards the meeting place. Scratching the back of his head, he grinned, contemplating the fact that the man was either extremely honest or terribly naive, paying too much attention to various little things. Either way, if he accepts his help, he feels he'll be disappointed in him. They'll figure something out on their own. He walked away slowly, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the floor. Each step reflected his inner sadness and disappointment. He realized the depth of the problem but felt completely powerless before it. Hyun spoke after the guild leader, expressing his desire to help Manhwa not as a Thunder Emperor. The sudden attack of the monsters required an immediate and coordinated response. It was necessary to hold the line of defense, as S-rank hunters played a key role in protecting humanity from powerful threats. The guild leader, along with the young fighter, shouted enthusiastically that they were ready for battle. They both stood side by side, showing unity and determination in the face of the impending threat. Skeleton-like monsters were advancing towards them, their bony bodies gnashing with every step. The guild leader, along with the young fighter, wasted no time in preparing for battle, ready to defend their territory at any cost. He noticed with alarm that they were gradually being pushed back and urged his subordinates to intensify their efforts to prevent the monsters from reaching their positions. The S-rank hunters, with their outstanding combat skills, occupied strategic positions on the defense line, effectively repelling monster attacks and protecting key facilities. Once in front of the boss room door, the group stopped. They regrouped, checked their gear, and prepared for the battle ahead. Tension was in the air, and everyone was focused and ready for action. The hunters sat slumped and exhausted after a long and hard battle. Once in the Virang dungeon, they fought hordes of skeletal monsters. Even though they had been battling smaller opponents with them, their fatigue and injuries were beginning to take their toll. He wondered how the boss handled such an ordeal alone. He pondered that it might be wise to bring in some of the W-rank hunters as human shields. If the hunters can't resist the regular monsters, then defeating the boss becomes a serious problem, and at this rate, they will all be finished off. He thought about his companion's words about the W-rank mercenaries, whose value was 300 million. After all, they were not bandits, and that kind of money would be hard to find. He pondered on how they should be in that situation. The S-rank hunter had handled the boss last time, though he fell towards the end. Now with two in the team, they hoped to succeed. The guild leader felt anxious. He thought that perhaps he should have brought in some of the hunters because they were right. His gaze slid downward, reflecting his inner turmoil. Would he be able to last asking such a question? He continued to ponder. What if by some unfortunate chance, both he and Unshik were injured? Hen turned to Ho's son, young Shik, respectfully as usual, to which the latter only noted his presence in surprise. He grinned, the corners of his lips lifting slightly, giving away a chuckle when he heard the greeting. Unshik and Ho pounced on Hen, their voices ringing with indignation. They demanded to know what was wrong with him and what he was doing. Ho clenched his fists and frantically tried to find out who had done this to him. But Hen only continued to laugh. Hen thought about the battle ahead and confidently decided that today they would take this boss to hell. He was ready to take charge and lead the team forward, counting on his brothers to trust him and follow his instructions. The blows shook the ground and shouts merged with the rumble of battle. Hen moved swiftly, dodging while Unshik and Ho furiously dashed forward in a coordinated attack. Hen gazed into the battlefield, perplexed. Instead of the boss, only small undead appeared, as if something had gone wrong. A thought crept into his head: had someone else come before and destroyed him? But that was unthinkable. If the Hunters Association caught someone who dared to do such a thing, his career would be destroyed. Who would take such a risk? He glanced at the older man and decided firmly that it was better to stop the raid, as he saw no point in continuing. Something was obviously wrong. The older man looked back, waiting for an explanation, but only asked a question. There were so many of them, he felt that his magical powers were running out. Each spell was harder to cast, and fatigue stiffened his movements. He clenched his teeth, realizing he wouldn't last much longer. He looked around the battlefield, wiping the sweat from his forehead. The boss was nowhere to be found, and he didn't know why, but it didn't matter anymore. They had almost outnumbered all the enemies. All that was left to deal with was the remnants. Once their magic powers recovered, they could go back and look for the boss. But it was pointless to continue fighting, as in their condition they were unable to defeat the enemy. He only had strength left for a couple of spells, and each successive one was getting harder. Eunshik and Ho felt that their strength was running low. To damage the boss in such a way, one would have to be almost unconscious. The thought of beef soup kept them busy. Those S-class guys definitely wouldn't be able to handle such a task. The Elder had probably expected more, but now they were barely hanging on. The Elder looked at the team and, sensing that there was no more strength left, decided it was time to end the sweep. He evaluated the past work and realized that the day had not brought the expected result, but still decided that it was not the end and praised his team. He offered to return to the same spot another time when their strength was restored. The guild leader came up just in time, noticing the weariness in their eyes. He sighed tiredly, feeling his arms literally falling off from the exertion. He also said, giving the command to finish, that everyone had done well, it was time to rest. He also told them to leave, pointing them to the exit. But before the crew could disperse, he grinned and added that this was just the beginning. There was confidence in his voice, for there was more to come. It was then that Hen realized that that battle was only a small part of the trials ahead of them, and something more serious lay ahead. His words were not a mere statement of fact, but a determination, a willingness to move on despite his fatigue. That battle was over, but the journey was far from over. New battles and new challenges lay ahead, and there was no retreat. The Elder waved his arms sharply to the sides, his movements broad and expressive as if he were trying to convey something important. Hen stood by his side, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched silently. His gaze remained calm, but inside he was already preparing for the next challenge. A new monster emerged from the darkness ahead, a huge skeleton with brightly glowing eyes. It was a boss monster, a giant rank-plus skeleton, and its presence instantly inflamed the atmosphere, making the hunters wary. The skeleton slowly raised its head, its glowing eyes staring directly at Hen and the Elder. A low, rumbling voice sounded. The monster was trying to speak to them. He prophesied that he was the boss, as if confirming his title. Wary of the situation, exclaimed with irritation, realizing that the moment was far from the best. He quickly looked around at the hunters and commanded them to get ready. It was necessary to finish the boss in one fell swoop before the situation got out of control. The hunters quickly took up positions, focusing their magic. Fire arrows flashed in the air, their flames quivering as they waited for the command. An electrical discharge ran through the ground, creating tension, ready to come back outward in a devastating blow. An ice spear formed in the hands of one of the mages, its surface glistening, radiating deadly cold. The atmosphere heated up, they all unleashed their spells on the giant skeleton at once. Spells rained down on the skeleton, flashes of fire, lightning and ice illuminated the battlefield. But when the dust cleared, not a single scratch was untouched. They were surprised that such a powerful blow and no effect and no magic helped. They raised their heads, looking straight into the monster's face, which was now completely open. The empty eye sockets shone with an ominous light, and the bony smile seemed to mock their attempts. Their magic didn't work, the spells dissipated, leaving no trace on the giant skeleton. The hunters froze in shock, realizing their helplessness in the face of that threat. The thought that this was the end flashed through everyone's mind. Hen abruptly snapped out of his seat, his voice cutting through the growing panic. His shout made everyone wake up, bringing them back to reality. They had no time for fear, as they needed to act. Ho, with an expression of determination on his face, quickly looked at the situation. Yong-shik's eyes glittered with steely determination. He did not hesitate, instantly assessing the situation. Ho and Eunshik were ready for action, their silhouettes clearly standing out against the tense scene. Ho gripped his weapon tighter, his face contorted with effort. He fought as hard as he could, each blow and each thrust and each pressure was a heavy fatigue in his body, but he didn't give up. The mages were outraged at what was happening. They could not believe that their most powerful spells had no effect on the monster. Ho shrieked indignantly, "What the hell?" There was a shiver of rage in his voice. He couldn't understand how their efforts could have been futile. His eyes glittered with rage, and his hands clenched into fists ready to attack again. And Eunshik shouted, "SSS-RANKER." His voice was full of despair and rage. He too couldn't believe that the monster was so strong that it was ignoring their efforts. A fire of determination lit up in his eyes. Watching what was happening, Hen scrutinized every movement. He believed that in such a battle, they would be able to find a weakness, even if it was hidden in the most unexpected moments. Deep down, he knew that the moment had not yet arrived, and they would be able to find a way to win despite the odds. Yen-shik moved very quickly, almost instinctively. His fingers clutched the rough ropes soaked in sweat and dust. The monster in front of him twitched, revealing teeth as sharp as blades. But the guy didn't retreat. The monster lashed out with more force, the ropes snapping. The boy darted to the side again, narrowly avoiding the blow. His heart was pounding in his ears, but he was already calculating his next move. There was very little time. Just like the small man had told him, he had to use Plan B. Hen stood in the very center, confidently erect, his gaze shining with excitement. Unshik and Ho stood on either side of him. Their eyes widened, their faces frozen in an expression of genuine shock. Hen laughed, left that strategy by the materials available in the association in the C-rank boss section. This was the first time he had to think about tactics over an opponent below A rank, so he took the time to study it. It was the boss, a giant skeleton. Its size was staggering, where its every movement was accompanied by a resounding sound and its blows had crushing power. However, the same colossal mass made it slow and sluggish, which left room for maneuver. The giant skeleton's weaknesses were obvious, its knees. These were the ones that needed to be struck in order to deprive it of mobility and weaken it considerably. Hen had given clear instructions for them to use their speed advantage and attack before the boss could strike. He was going to signal them at the right moment. Unshik tensed up abruptly, his expression replaced with anxiety. He tried to comprehend the situation, and this all he managed to find all this information in just one night, spent studying the materials and analyzing the boss's weaknesses. Hen smirked, squinting his eyes slightly. After all, he was something of a writer himself, albeit a novice for now, but even a novice knows that a good story hinges on details and victory on a carefully considered strategy. Hen continued the thought, confidently writing down that for a writer, research equals that's the foundation. His deep understanding of the subject will not produce anything worthwhile, whether it's a book or a plan to win. Yongshik raised his hand in gratitude, smiling broadly. He was determined, realizing that with this step they had come closer to their goal. But he knew that there was an even more difficult stage ahead of them. We had to prepare for the next step, which didn't promise to be easy. Before attacking, the boss let out a loud roar that shook the air and warned of his intentions. When they dodged, they had to try to move left and right to avoid a direct hit and maintain their mobility, that way they would share his attention. When they launched their attack, they needed to hit the joints, that was where his weak spot was hiding. The more often they hit there, the better chance they had of weakening him and making it difficult for him to move further. Ho flew into the air, his eyes burning with excitement. He rushed forward with vigor, accompanying his attack with a loud battle cry that echoed through space, heralding the beginning of the strike. His attack hit the target with force, leaving behind the rolling sound of impact and a whirlwind of raised dust. When they succeed in neutralizing the enemy in this way, it will be their first real success. Hen shouted Ho's name loudly, his voice sounding sharp and anxious. At that moment, the tension had reached its limit, and everyone knew that the next second could decide the outcome. Yongshik fought with all his might, not allowing himself a single second of weakness. They needed to deal maximum damage to the core, the only point that could finally finish off the enemy. Each attack had to be precise and powerful, otherwise the boss could take the hit and continue the battle. Each attack had to be precise and powerful, otherwise the boss could withstand the blow and continue the battle. And that's the punch, cross to cross. His hand slammed into the target with all his might, the sound echoing around him. His muscles clenched from the exertion and his breathing hitched, but he didn't stop, preparing to strike next. Unshik stumbled and collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily. The impact was too strong, knocking the last of his strength out of him. Dust rose around him, but he clenched his teeth and tried to get up, knowing that he could not give up. A tear rolled down Yongshik's cheek, mixing with sweat and dust. He clenched his teeth, but the trembling in his chest could not be hidden. At that moment, Ho shouted, his voice piercing through the noise of the battle, forcing Yongshik to raise his gaze. Hen clutched the notebook tightly in his hands, his gaze focused. He shouted a command at the right moment, then jumped back, watching the battle intently. His eyes quickly moved from one fighter to another. The skeleton of the monster towered before them, holding a huge spear in its bony hands. Its empty eye sockets seemed to stare, and every movement was accompanied by the ominous creaking of bones. The monster stood face to face with the hunters, ready to deliver a devastating blow. As the battle raged on, Hen watched carefully, assessing their tactics. But in an instant, he seemed to realize something, and a shadow of understanding flickered in the depths of his skull. The skeleton didn't stop, continuing to swing at the hunter with its huge peekaboo. Each of his movements was heavy but inexorable, and the air around him shook with the force of the blow, ready to collapse at any second. Tears rolled down Hen's cheeks. He realized that the strategy was just a plan, but if he didn't have the strength to implement it, it would all be for nothing. One of them screamed, his voice shaking with despair. At the same time, The other observer frowned, realizing the inevitable. These S-ranks had no chance of defeating such a powerful boss from the start. Hen quickly assessed the situation and came to the only conclusion that there was no other option but to intervene. Lightning was already flashing on his right hand, ready to fall on the enemy. Yongshik held the claw, trying his best to stay on his feet and not give up. His hands were trembling with tension, but he clenched his teeth, ready to fight to the end. Hen continued to watch the hunters and his companions, scrutinizing their every move. His gaze was focused, and his thoughts were rapidly analyzing the course of the battle. Yongshik thought for a moment, remembering the tactics they had used over and over again. But now the situation demanded a change. He decided it was time to make a change, adapt to the enemy, and try a new approach. Hen thought about the tactic. Would it really work? He thought about it, going over the possible outcomes in his head. It all came down to one thing: if they didn't try it, they wouldn't know. He was talking about the very tactics they used every week, honing their skills in battle. At that moment, Hen was carefully writing everything down in his notebook, trying not to miss a single detail. Yongshik was determined that even though Man Sasung wasn't around, they would still join forces. Their entire fight was now for his sake, and they wouldn't stop until it was over once and for all. Ho nodded, accepting the decision. As always, his role was to distract the enemy. He prepared for action, concentrating on his every move, knowing that the success of the entire team depended on his maneuvers. Ho abruptly snapped out of his seat, and without losing his fighting spirit, he loudly shouted a taunt towards his opponent. His voice echoed through the space, attracting the attention of the giant skeleton. Ho challenged his opponent with excitement, his voice ringing with mockery. He smirked, making a defiant gesture, knowing full well that his words would only anger the skeleton more. The one actually froze for a moment, as if pondering what he had said. But then, creaking his bones, began to turn around in his direction. The skeleton, creaking and rattling his bones, rushed after Ho. His massive footsteps shook the ground, but despite his strength, he remained slow. Ho was slipping away deftly, giving his enemy no chance to catch up with him. He grinned and, without turning around, shouted a signal. Now it was his partner's turn to deliver the decisive blow. The chains bound the monster tightly, preventing it from moving. He jerked, trying to break free, but the links only cut harder into his bones, restricting his every movement. Yongshik gripped the chain with all his might, preventing the monster from breaking free. His arms were strained to the limit, and the links were so tight that sparks flashed as they rubbed against the enemy's bones. The monster twitched, but each tug only strengthened his grip. Yongshik triumphantly held the chain tightly, restraining the monster, his voice echoing across the battlefield. At the same moment, Ho rapidly bounced backward, trying to get a safe distance away so that the giant skeleton wouldn't collapse right on top of him. Ho cast a quick glance at his partners, realizing that the decisive moment had arrived. Brother Man Sasung's final hold was what was going to set the stage for that battle. He held his breath, preparing to see the final crushing blow. Yongshik ran forward rapidly. Every step was straining his muscles, but he did not slow down, knowing that the outcome of the battle was about to be decided. He confidently confirmed Ho's words, clutching his weapon tighter. Sasong could crush the core with a single blow, leaving the enemy no chance. But now they had to work together. Yongshik understood this, clutching his weapon tighter. Only by joining forces could they complete this battle. Ho didn't waste any time. He rushed into the attack, moving with a precision and speed that left the monster no chance. Yongshik and Ho simultaneously rushed forward, their movements perfectly stacked. He struck crosswise, unleashing all his strength. A powerful blast of energy cut through the air, leaving behind a rumbling roar. It was their final attack, crushing, unstoppable, hitting the enemy with incredible power. The impact struck the monster's core with devastating force, splitting its surface. A flash of blinding light filled the space, accompanied by a deafening crackle. Cracks rapidly spread all over the skeleton's body, and in the next second it began to collapse, crumbling into a cloud of dust and debris. Yongshik, Ho, and everyone else were breathing heavily as they watched their final technique conclude the battle. The boss disappeared, scattering the last sparks of energy in the air. It meant only one thing: that the battle was over. All at once they shouted with joy, realizing that the battle was over. They had survived, their voices echoing across the empty battlefield. Now there was only one thing left to do: to find them a way out and get out of there. As Hen watched, he could feel the tension finally subsiding. Their concerted efforts had resulted in a victory, and he couldn't help but marvel at it. Hen watched the team carefully, feeling a surge of respect. They had gone beyond his strategy, managing to adapt to the unexpected. Even when their lives hung in the balance, they didn't give up, continuing to fight until the very end. Their determination and cohesion allowed them to go beyond the original plan. They created a new strategy on their own, adapting to the situation and bringing the battle to a victorious conclusion. This battle changed them not only as hunters but also as a team. New challenges lay ahead, but now they knew they could overcome anything. And it was growth, not just in strength, but in understanding, in the ability to work together. They were on their way to the hospital where Manhwa was. Despite their fatigue and the signs of battle, their steps were confident. Now, after all they had been through, it was important for them to see him, the one they had fought for. Manhwa lay in the hospital room, staring at the ceiling, his mind on one thing, his comrades. In the semi-darkness in the room, he quietly recited their names, Jiho, Ho, and Unshik. He didn't know, but he felt that they had fought. With tears in his eyes, he lay there, unable to hold back his emotions. Tears rolled down his cheeks, and a heaviness grew in his heart. He whispered words of forgiveness to his son, feeling the pain of the past clenching his chest. All because he had failed. The bitterness of defeat clutched at his heart, holding him back. If only he'd been stronger. If only he'd been able to make a difference. But the past could not be brought back, and now only regret remained, dragging a heavy weight behind it. In utter confusion, he woke up abruptly, breathing heavily. His head was buzzing and his thoughts were confused. He looked around, trying to figure out where he was, and frowned. Everything around him was unfamiliar, sterile, and cold. Suddenly, fragments of memories flashed before his eyes. He saw the huge monster bearing down on him, the sharp pain piercing his body as the enemy struck. That moment was the last thing he remembered before everything went dark. He thought it was all done for his son. He put a hand to his forehead and frowned, trying to sort out his thoughts. Was there nothing he could do? Scraps of the battle came to mind, but the more he tried to remember, the more he felt powerless. His fingers clenched into fists, and bitterness flared in his chest with renewed vigor. That he was nothing. The thought bounced around in his head, keeping him on his toes. If he couldn't do it, then what would he do in normal life? How to move on when everything he had built collapsed before his eyes. Unshik, Ho, and Hen stood at the door, gazing intensely into the room. As soon as Manhwa stirred, Ho couldn't contain his emotions, his eyes lit up and his voice sounded loud and joyful. He shouted with delight that their brother had finally woken up, filling the room with lively energy. A tear rolled down Yongshik's cheek. Looking at the weakened Manhwa, he could hardly contain his emotions. Did he realize how worried they were about him? Manhwa lowered his gaze, sighed heavily, and silently apologized to them. Ho looked at the chief with a smile, conveying confidence with his look. Hen and Enshik stood beside him with a slight smirk on their faces. While the guild chief had been lying unconscious, they had done everything they needed to do. Now gathered together, they stood in front of him as one cohesive team. Manhwa looked up at them and his chest clenched with emotion. They'd made it through. Now he no longer had to worry about the money for Jiho's operation, his team had handled everything. He looked at them in amazement, realizing that all that money was the result of their hard work at hired part-time jobs. All three of them laughed, relief and joy mixed in their laughter. That difficult moment when they had worried about the future seemed far away and not so important. Yenshik grinned as he pointed to the money they had collected. All of the money was from the shabos and the funds from the past gate, now enough to cover the cost of Wanho's operation. Manhwa couldn't believe his ears, staring dumbfoundedly at his comrades. He felt a deep shame. His face became serious. He could not accept money from his comrades, for it was their effort, their labor, and he did not want to be a burden. Even in such a situation, pride prevented him from accepting help. Ho couldn't help but cry, his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. He couldn't understand why the chief was refusing. Why couldn't he just accept help when they had all been through everything together? Unshik looked at Song with irritation, unable to understand his refusal. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Anxiety sounded in his voice, and he added, thinking of his brother, whether he had thought of his son Jiho at all. Manhwa looked at his companions with determination, but with sadness in his eyes. He didn't say he wouldn't take the money, but he couldn't afford to just take it, knowing the risks they had taken. He was ready to return it as soon as he could. Ho looked at Manhwa with relief and slight irritation. He said, smiling slightly, then what was the point of this? He said for the chief to just take them since they knew his position. Manhwa muttered quietly, looking around at his comrades, that this was his position. And he knew that his refusal made no sense. But pride and responsibility for the team held him back. He thought that everything was behind him, but his inner worries and unresolved issues were still weighing him down. The realization that his decisions were leaving a mark was like a wall that had fallen down and still needed to be fixed. He lowered his head tiredly, feeling the fatigue come in waves. He was so damn tired, he whispered, and his shoulders slumped heavily as his thoughts consumed everything else again. Every day, they went through 3 or even 4 gates, exhausting themselves to the limit. Man Sa Song understood their condition, as he had been through it himself. In response to their reproaches, he only exhaled tiredly. He had no other choice, since Jiho was sick, and they had no other choice. The pace was unbearable. If this continued, not only Jiho but they would be the first to collapse from fatigue. This thought was in the air, and everyone on the team realized that they felt the same way. One of them addressed the deputy head. The voice sounded tired, but also hopeful that he would make the right decision. The deputy guild leader looked at his comrades, his gaze serious. He was well aware of how many more times they would have to deal with the consequences of the boss's decision. As long as things went on like this, the guild would never rise to the C rank. Such a thought weighed on his mind. They all work their asses off just to keep up with him. One by one, they are exhausted, drained, injured, and end up in the hospital. Therefore, sooner or later, their bodies would simply fail. If things continue like this, the guild risks not only losing their chance to rank up, but also losing the hunters themselves. And he was going to create his own guild, build it according to his own rules, make it strong and independent. But the reality was much harsher than that, and instead he and his companions only exhausted themselves trying to keep up with the boss's ambitions. Everything that was happening, the endless fatigue, the injuries, the fear of the future, was his fault. If only he had made a different decision, if only he hadn't let the situation go this far. But now it was too late for regrets. He looked at his companions, their tired faces, and one thought flashed through his mind. This was his dream. It was their common goal, their aspiration, but he realized how hard it was to go to it when the step was given with such pain and effort. He stood in silence, staring at the family photos arranged on the table. Each picture reminded him of what he had wanted to achieve and what he had left behind. He kept looking at the pictures, at the faces that had been so alive and vivid but now remained only in his memory. The family he couldn't save would always remain a heavy weight on his mind. Such memories were like a wound that would not heal. Man Sa Song sat absorbed in his thoughts and went back to the moment he had made his decision. All because I'd put the burden of responsibility on their shoulders, he thought, feeling a heaviness in his chest. And they needed to think about what they wanted to do with their lives. Unshik sighed indignantly, saying that everything had happened because of Richard, the traitor who had ruined everything in his opinion. Ho, on the other hand, remained confident and calm. He assured that the blame should not be shifted to others. And he didn't understand why the whole situation was linked to the actions of their chief. Hen stood beside him, his eyes covered, and the words he spoke seemed resolute, yet full of doubt. He spoke of staying on as an assistant even if it didn't match his ambitions and dreams. Man Sa Song silently looked at Hen, his eyes hiding many thoughts. He realized that this decision, though it seemed temporary, was important to everyone. He nodded discreetly and only noted that if Hyung decided to stay, his place would always be here. Hen thought about the recent feedback about his protagonist being stuck in one place. He didn't understand everything. From his point of view, the protagonist continued to grow, learning new skills and becoming stronger, increasing his rank step by step. But then with the help of them all, he realized that character development is not just about growth levels and new skills, but also about dealing with internal conflicts and making tough decisions. He realized that for his character, as well as his friends, going through the gate wasn't just a way to get stronger. They weren't going there to pump up like his protagonist, but to protect what was important to them. Each of them was willing to fight because they believed in their boss and wanted to help him. Hen realized that his team's determination showed courage beyond their ranks. Thinking back to the guild introductions, he realized that the theme of his story would be titled Family Matters Most. And there, amidst such trials, he could gain experiences he wouldn't find anywhere else. So he will continue to help for the sake of his protagonist's growth. Man Sa Song looked at Hen with respect, realizing that for the sake of the guild, they were willing to go to any lengths. He knew each of them was willing to sacrifice something important for the common good, and that made them a true family, able to overcome any difficulties. And he realized he wasn't alone. Man Sa Song realized that he used to be selfish, afraid of pain and thinking only of himself. Now, looking back at everything that had happened, he realized how much he had changed. He realized he was doing much better now. He also thought with a smirk as he turned to the guys that maybe that was the moment it was time to be a little selfish. And Unshik added with a smile that let it be as long as it was, holding back his emotions. And beside him, Yen Shik pondered, realizing the significance of what was happening. but never finished the thought, realizing that he could finally help in any way he could. Huge buildings shuddered, giving off the crackling sound of breaking structures. Cracks spread across the walls, concrete crumbled, and metal beams twisted under the onslaught of flames. The fire roared, devouring floor after floor. The shriek of shattering glass mingled with the thud of collapsing ceilings until the building slowly but inevitably began to crumble downward, burying whatever was still inside. On the hot ground, covered with the traces of battle, stood warriors dressed in thick protective suits. Their faces were hidden by masks and hoods, leaving only the glow of their eyes reflecting the fiery flashes of battle. They held heavy swords in their hands and fought the monsters. Dust and smoke covered the battlefield, but no one retreated. Their mission was clear: exterminate the threat and survive at all costs. Mr. Duhuan called out to the soldiers to close ranks and draw their swords forward. Their steps were firm and their movements were polished. Each blow hit the target, knocking the monsters back. They moved forward, throwing the enemy back step by step, giving them no chance to break through their defenses. The eyes of the flying monsters blazed with fire, reflecting the raging flames around them. They circled above the fighting men, diving down in an attempt to break through the defenses. But the warriors did not waver. Duhuan stood clutching the hilt of his sword, staring intently into the monster's eyes. The monster stared back at him with its mouth open, a bright orange light pulsing in its depths. Standing still, he held his shield in front of him, preparing to withstand the blow. A hot wave of fire approached, reflecting in his eyes, but he did not retreat. The flying monster floated in the air with its wings spread out. The flying monster hovered in the air with its wings spread out, fire streaming out of its mouth, illuminating everything around it with a bright scarlet light. Duhuan and his hunter stepped forward, shielded by their shields despite the heat raining down on them. The flames reflected in their armor, but they did not retreat as they continued toward the fire-breathing monster. The towering mountain S-Rang named Chong Hongchai turned to Mr. Duhuan, anxiously clutching his sword hilt and shield, inquiring if he was all right. The lord nodded, exhaling restrainedly and keeping his guard up, gazing at the monster again. They realized that even with the support of the first and second elements of the detachments, their forces were gradually waning and their positions were surrendering under the onslaught of the enemy. Still, no matter how powerful their squad was, the monster was still a monstrous threat, unpredictable, deadly, terrifying in its mere presence. Her name was Boss Diablo SS-Rang. Mr. Duhuan decided firmly that he would protect the members of the Ho-Jun Guild at all costs by taking responsibility for their safety. White Robe Ho-Jun S-Rang was telling the gentleman not to worry and to be able to walk calmly. Mr. Duhuan understood that this time he would have to risk his life to defeat the enemy and protect his guild. Protect the guild from a sinister monster whose rage was boundless. Fireballs roared out of its mouth, illuminating the surroundings with a hot light. He stared at that beast, trying to realize its nature, but he couldn't understand what drove that indomitable force. As the Lord stood on the ground, the monsters hovered in the air, circling above him, while around him, huge fragments of rocks chaotically surged into the air. This was the test known as the Thunder Wheel, which was a new challenge for everyone, testing their strength, endurance, and determination to the limit. Duhuan struggled to move forward through the fierce storm, rocks swirling around him, the scalding wind whipping his armor. But he did not stop, making his way step by step to his goal. Realizing that there were advantages to a long life, and trying to cover his face with his hand, continued to move forward through the raging storm. He never thought he'd live to see such a day. Yes, his grandson might look a little rough, but he knew the truth. With a smile, he looked at the person approaching him. The one who had come to rescue him was none other than the grandson of the Thunder Emperor himself. With sadness in his eyes, he looked at him and after a short pause, said that he hadn't really come to rescue him, but to ask a favor. He only lowered his head, sighed, and thought. Instead of a simple answer, his mind was racing, trying to find an explanation for his decision. An airplane flew slowly over the tall building, casting a long shadow over the streets below. Its metal body gleamed in the sun, and its powerful engines made a steady hum as they filled the space. Fans had already gathered at the airport, holding placards and flags. The air was filled with lively voices and camera flashes, and security guards kept a close eye on order. They were talking excitedly, trying to see the long-awaited guest among the arriving passengers. The boy lowered his gaze, thinking for a moment, then took off his glasses and looked into the distance. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of years. One of the 12 legendary apostles, battle god Sato Kanzuya, leaned his head to the side with a smirk and looked around thoughtfully. A thought flashed through his mind as he wondered how a guy was doing. The head of the Korean Association, Park Ji-han, did not hide his surprise. He had never imagined that he would see Mr. Kanzuya himself here, holding a cup of coffee in his hands, grinned. He calmly took a sip, then nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his appearance, and apologized nonchalantly for catching his interlocutor off guard. He leisurely placed the cup of coffee on the table, continuing to maintain his nonchalant grin as if enjoying the moment. Slightly leaning forward with a serious expression, took out an envelope from his inner pocket and carefully placed it in front of Park Ji-han. Park Ji-han frowned as he pondered the situation. If the director of the Japan Hunter Association himself sent one of the 12 apostles, then the matter was really serious. He felt a chill run down his spine. Sweat trickled down his temple and his hands trembled slightly as he finished reading the letter. The destroyer and Jaina were dead. Kanzuya shook his head, his gaze grim. 2 members of the 13 stars of the azure sky had been destroyed. An irreparable loss. A heavy silence hung in the air. The head of the Korean Association sat there, unable to believe what he had heard. Tears rolled down his cheeks and the pain of loss enveloped him like a heavy burden. His gaze was blank, as if he was trying to comprehend how this could have happened. The 13 stars of Azure Sky, the 13 hunters, were recognized as the strongest in the world, second only to the 12 apostles. Their status was above all others and they were considered the closest to the legendary rank. Those hunters were a symbol of strength and honor, and their presence in any battle meant almost guaranteed victory. Despite their strength, they were still human, and each of them carried his own weight in his heart. Unable to believe what was happening, Kanzuya wondered who could have killed such powerful hunters. Sadness and bewilderment swept over him. All those years they had been a symbol of invincibility, and now that even they were falling, the world seemed so much more vulnerable. Park Ji-han clenched his fists with aggression, his eyes filled with rage as he said, "Black Spear." This name was associated with someone who stopped at nothing and spared no one in his path. There was a burning hatred in his voice as he remembered their destructive power. Addressing Park Ji-han, he assured him that the consequences were catastrophic. The destruction of the 2 members of Azure Sky not only shook the socio-economic system, but also intensified international conflicts. Everyone was aware of who was behind the recent tragedies, and that only added to the tension. He bowed his head, realizing it was all their doing. He firmly believed that only the awakened are the true people, and those who have not awakened exist only to serve and obey. The Black Spear organization was recognized as an extremist group that committed numerous atrocities. States around the world declared it a terrorist organization, scrutinizing its dangerous ideology that threatened world security and stability. All that time, they had only observed the activities of the Black Spear, but the recent incident had made it clear that such an organization was more than just a terrorist group. He alone was instructed by the president of the association to deliver an important message. In light of these developments, the chairman hoped that their country's military forces would be ready to join forces with their allies. Park Ji-han nodded confidently, and they shook hands firmly. They exchanged thanks, and Park Ji-han expressed his willingness to join. Kanzuya handed him a document detailing the recent incident and the terms of the alliance. Kanzuya pointed out that the head of their association was being overly cautious, to which Park Ji-han reacted with surprise, trying to understand the hidden meaning behind those words. Kanzuya also thought about the fact that he could have intervened and destroyed all the enemies in one blow, but the head of the association seemed to have inexplicable misgivings about that. He grinned, his gaze becoming piercing, as if he already knew the answer before he heard it. Park Ji-han frowned, realizing that only the 12 in the entire world could afford to say such words with such casual confidence. Kanzuya stood across the street, quietly observing. A thought flashed through his mind that it seemed like it was time to meet him. Mansa-sung, his family and his team, Hyun, Ho and Un-shik, were sitting around the table enjoying their evening meal. They ate pizza, laughed, and talked, feeling the joy of a simple but important moment. Ho raised his tea glass, laughing, and motioned for everyone to fill their mugs and to get ready. He suggested we start by celebrating his return after practice was over, promising to keep the fun going from there. Hen went on to say that an equally important event was the small one's official entry into their guild, which also required a grand celebration. Everyone raised their glasses. And of course, they didn't forget to toast to the health and well-being of the boss and Ji-ho, their faithful companions and sources of strength. An explosion of merriment filled the room as everyone slammed their mugs against each other, and a loud hooray spread across the table. The festivities were just beginning. Everyone was enjoying the moment, devouring the pizza, smiles shining on their faces and cheeks filled with pleasure. The atmosphere was light and joyful, as if all worries had faded into the background. Little Ji-ho happily pointed to his portion, pointing directly at the pizza. His mom looked at him with a smile, laughing, and suggested that he try something else first. Ho sat at the table rubbing his belly and smiling happily. He was so full that he felt like he was going to burst. And Shik frowned his eyebrows as he watched Ho, who was enjoying his food with such ease. His gaze was full of bewilderment, and he couldn't understand how one could carelessly devour pizza. Shik muttered quietly as he watched Ho, who was struggling to hold back his portions. He was perplexed and asked him to eat his pizza normally. Ho and Shik started prancing around, laughing and fooling around. At one point, they were having so much fun that they rolled over from their chair, attracting the attention of everyone present. Manhwa Sung, his wife, and little Ji Ho watched Shik and Ho prancing around and couldn't contain their laughter. The atmosphere at the table was filled with joy and carefree fun. Shik and Ho continued to argue while Ho insisted on eating ice cream as well. Shik looked at him in bewilderment, not believing that he was still hungry after such a feast. Ho stood at the door, convinced that dessert was a necessary part of dinner. Eventually, Shik relented and agreed to go to the store with him, hoping the walk would help digest the edible. His wife went to give Ji Ho some medicine while he mentally expressed his displeasure. Manhwa Sung only nodded in agreement. Manhwa Sung instructed Hyun to put everything in a bag for sorting, and Hyun thanked him while clearing the table. Hen looked at him curiously, trying to figure out what exactly was special about yesterday. An elderly man, Hen's grandfather, appeared in the dark doorway. His gaze was shrewd and his posture was respectful. He was aware of the situation and was watching Do-hwan carefully as if assessing him. Hyun grimaced at the reference and waved him away, signaling that he didn't think of him as his grandfather. Sung only grinned at the discrepancy, however. Hen sighed and grudgingly explained that it was just habit, though they weren't really related by blood. Hen couldn't help but be surprised by the old man's sudden appearance. Not only had he interfered in their affairs without warning, but he had also transferred everyone to the VIP rooms, completely covering all medical expenses. It was unexpected and even a little suspicious. Manhwa Sung and his wife were stunned by this action. As it turned out, they were given back all the money they had spent on medical treatment up to that point. It was very unexpected for them that they could not believe what was happening. He even offered them a house, completely ready for them to live in, with furniture and everything they needed. It was more than they could have expected, and Manhwa Sung and his wife couldn't believe that someone was being so generous to them. Hen said that the best way to pay is to grow and get better. Everyone thought for a moment, realizing the importance of such words. Manhwa Sung smiled at Hyun. As soon as Ji Ho finished the operation, he would start creating a new guild recruitment, and then they would work for real with full dedication. And Hen added with a smile that he too would do his best to make the guild grow stronger. He wondered, knowing a lot of people and not pondering what kind of episode would come out of it all. Manhwa Sung glanced at Hung with a question, but he only nodded briefly, signaling that he needed to step back for a while. Hyun soared into the air, quickly disappearing from sight. Manhwa Sung glanced out the window, his face reflecting a mixture of surprise and annoyance as he watched the figure rapidly disappear. He landed in a dense forest of tall trees, where the air was filled with cool freshness. There wasn't a soul around. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional cries of birds broke the silence. He felt a familiar aura as if it permeated the very air around him. The energy was coming from there, he had no doubt about that. Suddenly, Kanzuya appeared in front of Hen. Their gazes met, tension hanging in the air. Kanzuya looked at him with a testing gaze as if waiting for an answer. Kanzuya tilted his head to the side, assessing Hen. His gaze was cold, but there was a faint satisfaction in the depths. It was as if he was checking to see if his strength was still intact, if he had lost any of his skills. Kanzuya smiled slightly as he watched Hen. There was interest in his gaze and a slight sneer in his voice, as if he already knew the answer, but still decided to ask him how he was doing.